First Generation, Volume 1, Chapter 1, Bradford. The skyline of the city was a string of grey pearls. If I stood on the bed in my attic bedroom, I could prop the sloping window in the roof open and heave myself up onto my elbows to scrutinise the view before me. Bradford in the 1950s was a town of heavy industry and was often covered in a fog, but the gritty particles in the air reflected and refracted the setting sun's glory in a way which transformed the horizon into a breathtaking technicolor screen, with pinks, oranges and mauves screaming triumphantly at the darkness. From here I could see the distant outline of the town hall, whose bell tower was modelled on the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. Forever shrouded in a heavy black coat from years of pollution, it dominated the distant town square. Years later, when it was cleaned, I was surprised to see it was actually a pale gold, and felt rather sorry for its new insubstantial covering. It seemed to be forever shivering in the bitter northern winters. We lived at No. 6 Cliff Villas, a large Victorian semi in a discreet row of similar dwellings. There was a chicken farm on one side and a dentist on the other. Both neighbours were called Townsend. As well as filling our teeth, the dentist supplied us with old editions of the National Geographic magazine, a larger-sized edition in those days, which furnished my childhood imagination with a wealth of colourful images. Ladies with long ringed necks, Buddhist temples, icy Arctic mountains and savanna wastes. I spent hours poring over these and travelling in my head to the myriad lands contained in the glossy pages. The chicken farmer delighted us kids. He showed us round the runs in return for doing his shopping. "Here's sixpence. I want 3 pence worth of lemon sherbets and a bag of blackjacks. Mind you don't eat any, neither." Occasionally, we would be asked to get a fish and 3 from the fish and chip shop. That's a cod and chips to you southerners, the 3 being 3 old pence, the cost of a bag of chips. Our reward was entering the dark, warm corridors where the hens squawked and flapped in their cages. We would press forward to the wire, half agog, half terrified. The noise, smell and commotion of these creatures were extraordinary. At Easter there were the sweet yellow chicks in the heated batteries, and sometimes, as a treat, Townsend gave us the odd egg to hold, still warm from its mother. We played in the narrow cobbled street, out back, still worn from old cart tracks. Indeed, the carts still came round regularly. The Rag and Bone Man's was one, when he trundled up and down the streets with his indecipherable cry for old clothes and bric-a-brac. Another was the cart that carried coal, which grimy men heaved onto their backs in sacks and poured down into the coal hole in the backyard, straight into the cellar, a dark, glittery stream which landed with a horrifying crash. We would interrupt our games to watch these fascinating activities and pat the huge steaming horses that waited patiently as the crashing and swearing took place. More often than not, we would be told to bugger off and leave us in peace. Then we would return to playing tin can squat or hopscotch. The former consisted of placing an old tin can in a chalk circle. Chalk was as indispensable to us kids as mobile phones are now. As well as marking out the squares for hopscotch, it was used for colouring wooden tops which we whipped into a frenzy with leather strings, standing back to watch and enjoy as the hues blended into a spinning rainbow. Whoever was it watched as another player kicked the tin out of the circle as far as he or she could. It ran after the can and put it back into the circle while the others hid. He then had to go and find the hiders. However, if at any point a hider had the good fortune to sneak back to the circle while the finder was finding, he or she could kick the tin again, causing a commotion which prompted us all to yell, "Tin can squat!" from whatever hiding place we were in, and then followed an undignified scramble while we all had to find new hiding places and elude the finder, who desperately ran from circle to circle while trying to get the others. Great fun. We would play for hours until the plaintive female cries began to fill the gathering darkness. "Alan! Tea time! Sylvia! Sylvia! Mary!" Or, "Come in now, you little bugger." We would troop off to our respective homes a little disconsolately, but conceding to a certain hunger after our exertions, passing the solitary lamplighter on the way as he raised his long taper to the Victorian lamps that still lined the back street and set them aglow, so that together with the red rays of the setting sun, the hued cobbles seemed to shine and gleam, as lovely as any Arabian desert. In the days before television, music and games featured largely in our lives. At home, my sister and I played our favourite, up and down the stairs with Simba, Simba being our huge, black and, we believed, highly intelligent cat. The rules were simple. Simba would sit on the bottom step and count to 20, while Tina and I would run and hide. The cat would then come and find us. The fun lay in his stealth and soft tread. We would never know where he was until he appeared, eyes shining with excitement, at the gap under the bed or the door of the wardrobe. Then we would scream with delight and all run downstairs again like maniacs. I played the game once on my own, but never again. I mistakenly closed the wardrobe door after Simba jumped in with me. I could not open it from the inside, and we both howled in misery till we were found. My mother was an opera singer in Estonia and taught singing in Bradford. Her favourite pupil, Svetlana, a handsome Russian woman of indeterminate age, would throw back her magnificent head and soulfully mount the scales, bosom heaving with emotion. I would come back from school and hear my mother pounding the piano while Svetlana swooped up the scale of C. My key turned in the lock and I entered the house. Oh, Mum, I'm home. Oh, hi, Mum. Is tea ready yet? Ooh, Mum. Oh. I gave up and got on with my homework. Sometimes, in an impish mood, I'd stand by the sitting room door doing loud farmyard impressions. The piano would stop and Svetlana would break off. What was that? My mother would mutter in reply. The singing resumed. My cow, dying in labour, gave voice again. Listen, what is this noise? I ran off, stifling giggles. My mother's musicality and love of all things cultural influenced our lives a great deal. I had piano lessons from the age of 5 and would be made to practice for hours on the sturdy upright in the sitting room, when Svetlana wasn't there, and later gave concerts at the Estonian Club. These latter occasions were nightmarish. Performing as an actor is one thing. You have a character with a life of its own which you can hide behind or become possessed by, but playing the piano, especially the tuneless wreck with sticky keys, which I had to play at the Estonian émigrés' gatherings, was another. One evening, I'd chosen Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata as my piece. All went well until I was about halfway through, when I realised that I simply could not hear what I was playing any longer. The bloody instrument was so hopelessly out of tune. I floundered, my hands relying purely on muscle memory, and imagined the horror and shame on my mother's face when I would eventually have to stop mid-piece, turn round to the politely expectant faces of the Bradford Estonian community, and apologise for my inadequacy. The image spurred me on, and I fumbled through an awful cacophony of noise until suddenly and miraculously the tune re-emerged. I was sweating with relief, but managed to finish, to a flurry of enthusiastic applause. The kindly audience loved a trier, but I learned a valuable lesson that was to help me on stage as an actor in later years. Press on regardless, even if you have to go wrong or make it up. It was more fun to play to myself at home. My mother and I took it in turns to play and sing, especially at Christmas. Estonians celebrate on Christmas Eve. We would light live candles, clamped onto the tree with quaint little tin holders, and sing carols around the piano. Then we would have a traditional meal of roast pork and sweet brown sauerkraut, followed by homemade trifle, and exchange gifts. Church featured largely in our lives too, not just on Christmas Eve when we would attend midnight mass, but almost every Sunday. We would attend the Lutheran church in Bradford, which the Estonians had taken over, it being the official religion in Estonia. My mother was extremely religious. She'd been brought up in the Russian Orthodox Church, and her paternal grandfather had been a priest in that religion. When she eventually moved to London, she attended the Orthodox Church in South Kensington, but as there was none in Bradford in those days, she contented herself with some of the rituals at home. We had to pray and kiss pictures of Jesus every night with crucifixes clasped in our hands, and say grace before every meal, for example. Eventually I rebelled and started attending the local C of E church, and then gave up regular practice of religion altogether, although I did return to it in later years, thanks to the memory of my mother, who had lit a flame of spirituality in me from an early age. What is it the Jesuits say about it? Give me the child until he is 7, and I care not who has him thereafter. Very true in my case. New Year's Eve had a strange tradition attached to it. My father would fill a bucket with water, then heat a ladleful of tin or lead over the flames of the fire until it was molten. He would then hurl the liquid metal into the water, where it solidified into a grotesque shape. We would all peer into the bucket and try and interpret what the shape resembled. Whatever it was would augur our fortunes for the year ahead. Somewhat at odds with the religious practices mentioned earlier, perhaps, but the Russians are notoriously superstitious as well as devout, and my mamma was no exception. We loved it all. The new year often offered snow, which brought out the hordes of neighbourhood children and their sledges. I had a brand new wooden beauty which I'd received from Father Christmas himself. He turned up at the Estonian Club Children's Christmas party and presented it to me in person. Attached to a length of grubby string, I dragged it proudly to a steep road 2 streets away, where scores of whooping brats were already turning the snow-covered cobbles into a mini version of the Cresta Run. I joined my gang in glee, and we negotiated the treacherous slope again and again, going faster and faster each time as the snow turned to ice, and whooping like banshees. Too soon the darkness fell, and we would crunch back home in the sparkling white wonderland that totally transformed our grey streets into a magical new kingdom. Even more dramatic weather conditions prevailed from time to time. A phenomenon peculiar only to northern industrial towns frequently occurred when it was foggy, when the natural elements combined with the polluted air to produce a thick miasma which we referred to as killer smog. No, not the name of a Swedish serial killer, but a thick, smelly, nasty and dangerous blight which stole the lives of scores of people when it crept over the city, especially the elderly. Citizens would rush out to the chemist to buy special masks smeared with unctuous, pungent salve, and wear them religiously until the threatening cloud had cleared, which sometimes took 2 to 3 days. I loved these times. Walking home from school became a new and exciting experience. You literally could not see a hand in front of your face, and no sound was to be heard except the muffled screams of the giant oblong snails that were the trolleybuses, their horns attached to the overhead wires that guided them, headlamps glowing eerily through the smog. The carefree, happy days of early childhood were drawing to a close, however, as the dreaded 11+ loomed. I sat the exam in trepidation, as we all did, knowing that our future schooling, nay, our whole lives, depended on it. My mother had put my name down to sit the entrance exam to Bradford Girls' Grammar School, which had the most excellent academic reputation in the area. I passed. We celebrated, and I began the 7-year sentence of what was to be the best education anyone could have wished for. Chapter 2. 1961, Bradford Girls' Grammar School. The atmosphere in the huge hall was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was awesome. 600 girls filed in complete silence, sat in silence, opened their hymn books and waited expectantly. Nothing moved or spoke. Then suddenly, commotion. 600 chairs pushed, scraped, and sat to attention as the girls stood. Miss Black, our head mistress, had entered. My first glimpse of her struck terror into my heart. Tall, awesomely tall, and fittingly dressed in black. Hair in a severe bun, she glided up the steps. Unnervingly, a small, slow, confident glance downwards, and then a seamless, hunched ascent to the platform where the sixth form waited, lofty as judges, arcing round her podium like acolytes at a black mass, no pun intended. Unsmilingly, mutely, she viewed the gathered assembly for a moment, picked up her hymn book from the lectern, and nodded to the pianist below. This routine would become as familiar to me as breathing, but now it was hypnotic. Reassuringly, the chords of the piano plucked out the opening notes of a hymn well known to the new herd of 90 or so, and almost hysterically we threw ourselves into song with the rest of the school. The hymn, thankfully, gave us time to get over the paralysing shock of finding ourselves in the myth that was the best school in Bradford, and assimilate our surroundings, and to take in our impressive head with the odd surreptitious glance, or four. Hymns, prayers, more prayers, blessings, notices, and finally, the welcome to the new girls. Her voice was slow, low, and perfectly enunciated. I'd never heard anything like it before in real life, except when the news was being read on television. She welcomed the new girls to the school, impressing upon us needlessly the immense honour that was being bestowed upon us in our acceptance there. And now I will read out the form lists. Alphabetically, she proceeded to read out the list for Upper 3C, then Upper 3B, her voice never wavering or pausing, simply plunging on like a faultlessly played organ toccata. Upper 3A, she recited on effortlessly until Leslie North, Janet Reynolds, Mary... Jam, is it? And horror of horrors, she not only paused and peered over her glasses in my general direction, but allowed herself a lopsided little smile that acted like a touch-paper to the entire school's amusement, which exploded like a firework. Off, 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 ha, 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 yak, yak. To use the cliché of wishing that the earth would swallow me up would be woefully inadequate to describe the turbulent tumult of emotions that assailed me then. I wished a black hole would swallow up the entire county of Yorkshire, except we hadn't done black holes in science yet. When, after what seemed like aeons, the girls subsided and my fellow classmates were wiping their eyes with relief at not finding themselves in my leaden shoes, Miss Black, who, I sensed, had not erred in her steely-eyed perusal of my form, still seemed to be awaiting a reply. An expectant silence fell, and I croaked, "Tamm!" "What?" Even a hand cupped to the ear. More giggles. The school recognised a great actress when they saw one. "Tamm!" Pause. "Mary... Tamm. Ann Turner. Gillian White." She droned on as if nothing had happened. I was forever marked out, not just as Jammy, a nickname that took me years to live down, but as someone with a strange surname. Not as strange as some. We had a Bambadji and a Weatherlake too, but somehow mine, and mine alone, had been singled out and ridiculed. And not till many, many years later did I ask myself why, when all the form lists were in alphabetical order, did Miss Black, when she stumbled among the T's, mentally jump to J. In the 50s, anyone who was not native Yorkshire was known as a bloody foreigner. I'd heard the words bandied at my family so many times that they'd become meaningless. I'd witnessed my mother being spat at in the street, and a 7-year-old friend, a little girl, was pushed down a flight of steep stone stairs by a group of classmates as a punishment for her funny accent. It seems barbaric now, but feelings were running high after the Second World War, and forgiveness of one's enemies was an alien concept. The Estonians in particular were seen as collaborators by the Brits. No one mentioned the cruelly inhumane ethnic cleansing that Stalin exercised over the Baltic states, where tens of thousands were sent to Siberia, the worst swear word imaginable in our household, apart from communist. There they were treated absolutely appallingly, toiling in icy crevasses in sub-zero temperatures till they dropped from hunger and exhaustion, ordered to march in bare feet in the deep snows, raped to death, and shot for the slightest misdemeanour, the latter mercifully a welcome release from the sufferings they had to endure. Few survived. My father lost 4 brothers to Stalin's gulags. The 5th returned, emaciated and almost mute. He hardly spoke again until his early death from tuberculosis. The grief my father had to bear must have been overwhelming. Like many refugees, he'd left his country behind, never to see it or his family again. But he rarely spoke of his personal experiences there, and I only ever saw him cry once, when a letter arrived from Estonia, telling him of his father's death. My parents spoke incessantly of the old country, embellishing its attractions like well-versed travel agents. the beauty of the countryside, the culture, the music, the literature, etc., etc. In my mind, it assumed a huge importance, like a faraway fairy tale kingdom, akin to heaven in my child's eyes, that I would never see. The sadness of losing their right to a homeland, and therefore an identity, was always present, and although I never really understood the reasons, I absorbed the atavistic zeitgeist that manifested itself most strongly at the Eesti Maja, or Estonian House. It was known simply as the Club, and was a regular Saturday night gathering point for Bradford's Estonian community. There, male cronies would gather to exchange reminiscences of old times. The women thronged in the kitchen to make cabbage soup and piroshki, and the children would play in the huge grounds surrounding the sprawling mansion that the émigrés had clubbed together to buy. There was always music and dancing, card-playing, lively discussion, nearly always about politics. The Estonians rarely talk about anything else. And the number one pastime, drinking. Vodka was a favourite. At home, my parents drank it neat like water with meals. I was given my first glass on my 7th birthday, and apparently downed it in one like a trooper. Number 2 pastime was singing. We had a male voice choir and a female one, which my mother conducted. The melodies and close harmonies these groups produced were sublime, expressing as they did all the pain and frustration of a small people with a small voice, on whom many injustices had been heaped over centuries of occupation by one tyrannical power or another, but whose woes were largely ignored. The singing troupes travelled to competitions all around England, and in later years, when the deep-rooted aversion to leaving England's borders for fear of being captured by the Russians had subsided, to Europe. The drawback for the first-generation offspring of this charming enclave of Eastern Europe was Estonian school. Every Saturday afternoon we had to troop obediently to the Estonian house and learn the grammar of the language that we all spoke fluently at home, our first language, in fact. In retrospect, it's puzzling to reflect on why some of us spoke English with a foreign accent and some didn't. I fell into the latter group, but I recall at the age of 5 or so mixing up English and Estonian to the incomprehension of my school friends, who couldn't understand when I referred to my Scotch coob, an expression my mother used to describe the garment I was wearing that day, a Scottish plaid skirt. The men and women who taught us on Saturday afternoons had been teachers in Estonia. Now they worked in the wool mills which comprised Bradford's main industry, as most refugees did back then. So the thrill of the one-day return to the old profession fuelled a zeal which was not quite so prevalent in our English weekday schools. Before the communists took everything they owned, my father's family had been landowners and farmers. He loved the countryside, but rarely saw it now, as he worked in the largest mill in the city, Lister's, which rivaled the town hall in size and structure, dominating a hill which could be seen from almost everywhere. Here he toiled long hours among mathematicians, surgeons and scientists, the finest brains in Estonia, packing wool. As I grew older and identified more and more with the country and culture that was nurturing me, I started to rebel against going to these lessons. Again, it's interesting to note that those friends, now 14 and 15, who still spoke English with an accent, were the ones who hung around the Eesti Maja at weekends. I wanted none of it. I'd long ago churlishly refused to perform any more humiliating piano recitals, and felt I had more interesting things to do with my weekends, like hanging out with mates and listening to the latest Beatles LP. But suddenly a new spectre arose, that of the Eesti Maja dance troupe. It was desperately short of female dancers and needed fresh blood. My mother, even though she was born in Omsk, Russia, ironically in Siberia, or Sibir, as she called it, was deeply committed to upholding the cultural traditions of the adopted country where she grew up. She journeyed by train from Omsk to Tallinn in 1917, when she was a babe in the arms of her maternal grandmother, a journey that took 3 months. Her family name was Kiselyov, and her father, Viktor, had fought as a colonel in the Tsar's army. Both parents were dead. Her mother, Aurora, from typhoid, and her father lost in action somewhere in Turkey. Now Grandmama was taking her and my Auntie Nina to White Russian relatives in Estonia to escape the new communist regime which would shortly rename her homeland as the USSR. So, like me, my mum was a first-generationer. My first reaction on hearing that I'd been press-ganged into the troupe was naturally deep outrage. I identified rather with my favourite book hero, William Brown, when he was subjected to the rigorous behind-the-ear washing that he had to undergo when an aunt came to visit. But then an odd kind of curiosity took over, and the thought of visiting dance festivals and perhaps sneaking off, untrammelled by parental supervision, to possibly frequent pubs and meet boys, both forbidden pastimes, was a prospect which seemed more and more attractive. I sulkily conceded, secretly rather excited at the new adventures which lay in store. I also identified with William Brown's boundless optimism, and bowed to my mother's insistence on following the dance steps of my ancestors. My friend, Margi Barbos, and I had seen the Estonian dance troupe perform at our annual Suvepäev, or literally translated, Summer Day, a festival of song and dance held in rotation every year at Leicester, Bradford and London, the three main Estonian settlements. We knew the dances well, but still had to learn and rehearse them on Saturdays after school, and the occasional Sunday. Margi and I turned up at the first rehearsal, trying to look nonchalant and unconcerned. The average age of the rest of the dancers was about 50, and I'm not exaggerating. We started on the first number, Galamees, accompanied by a squeezing, wheezing accordion, played by a squeezing, wheezing accordionist. Sweaty-pawed, balding apes pranced about with us nubile girls, flashing lots of eager teeth the while and capering about like good uns, inspired no doubt by our youth and energy. The climax of Galamees involved the men grabbing the women by the waist and hoisting us up into the air above their heads, grunting with exertion. Many a hernia was sustained along the way. We tried our best not to laugh, but often the sights and sounds proved too ludicrous to ignore, and we would collapse in hysterical giggles to the stern disapproval of the dance mistress. Another dance, male only, consisted of the participants fighting in 3/4 time with wooden staffs, rather reminiscent of the kind with which Friar Tuck accosted Robin Hood at their first encounter. It was rather like a fast version of a ritualised samurai sword display, meant to show off the masculine prowess of the young men of Estonia, a quality epitomised by the old Estonian folk hero Kalevipoeg, Galev's son. The dearth of young men at rehearsals was an irony which did not escape our young girlish hearts. Finally, we had a date for our first dance festival in Stone, Staffordshire, to which we would travel by coach, making the journey there and back in a day. The novelty of dancing had worn off somewhat for us, and we were ready for a diversion. On the way there, Margi and I idly whiled away the hours by speculating on what Stone would have to offer in the way of drinking haunts and men. We decided that we would have to pursue a rigid course confined by 4 unassailable perimeters. As we were going to Stone, we would get stoned, listen to the Stones, and drink only Stone's ginger wine, a most wicked concoction, we felt sure, only heard of, and as yet never tasted. Sadly, our exciting plans came to nothing, as unbeknownst to us, our mothers had instructed the dance mistress to keep a beady eye on us at all times, knowing us, no doubt, better than we knew ourselves, and thwarting our wayward intentions. We had to content ourselves with drooling longingly at an impossibly handsome young Morris dancer, not put off at all by the feminine style of handkerchief flapping he'd perfected, but hoping desperately that he would notice us and not be deterred by our ridiculous national costume, white embroidered blouse, silk beribboned headdress, white knee-high socks and frilly pinny. It never occurred to us that his costume was just as ludicrous. After the competition, inspired to boldness by the beautiful Morris man, we did manage to sneak away to a local pub and down a pint, but were dragged out by a furious dance mistress who sacked us from the dance troupe there and then. Even though the Estonians like a drink or two, they drew the line at any underage law-breaking. We were in disgrace, but it mattered not a jot. We'd been there, done that, and got the T-shirt. Our remaining Saturdays in Bradford were spent at the Mecca Locarno, a cavernous dance palace on Manningham Lane. There we bopped and grooved to the Moody Blues, Small Faces, Animals, Kinks, Yardbirds, and all the rest of the fabulous groups of the era, who actually came to visit many of the Bradford clubs over the following years, to our huge joy. Galamees was dead, buried and forgotten, Long live the swinging 60s. As well as the visiting pop groups, we had opera, ballet and theatre companies who regularly stopped off at Bradford. I was dragged along by Mum to see them all, culture vulture that she was. We saw films too. Biblical epics like Samson and Delilah and the Ten Commandments and other scarier offerings. The Mummy's Hand, for one. My mother, whose grasp of English was still not too good, had imagined that this would be a fond tale of parental love. Not so. It was, of course, a horror film about an Egyptian mummy that came to life and terrorised the inhabitants of the banks of the Nile. It terrorised me too, and I was dragged from the cinema screaming. I loved these early excursions, though, and wonder how much they influenced my career decision, bombarded as I was from a tender age by the turbulent dramas of these vastly varied and enriching spectacles, from Spartacus to Swan Lake. Bradford was and still is a richly cultural city, as if balancing the grimness of its industrial heritage with an overcompensation of all that lifts the human spirit. It's produced a wealth of composers, actors, artists and writers, notably Delius, J.B. Priestley, and of course the divine David Hockney, to name but a few. My sister was at Bradford Art College with David and brought him home to tea one day. My mother, although quite a free spirit for the times, didn't know quite what to make of him. He dyed his hair tartan that week, and as he sat and did a quick sketch of her, she decided that he was too bohemian for her taste. After he'd left, she pronounced the sketch bloody rubbish and proceeded to light the fire with it. Oh, Mum! But thanks to her, I knew in my heart that I would someday enter that wonderful world of Bohemia myself. Although I never gave voice to my inner stirrings, Mum wanted me to be a concert pianist, and I religiously took piano lessons up to the day I left school, just to keep her happy. When I finally confessed to my acting ambition, she accepted it with surprising equanimity, possibly again, knowing me better than I knew myself. Chapter 3, 1966, Early Amdrams. My first role on stage was as one of Santa's helpers in a Christmas play performed at Drummond Road Infant School at the tender age of 5. The title and content of the piece escape me, but I remember the thrill of marching and shouting loudly round the stage with my fellow gnomes, so much so that the huge ceiling fan vibrated, shuddered, and crashed to the ground to our huge delight. Patrick Troughton, the second actor to play the Doctor in Doctor Who, referred to theatre acting as shouting a lot in the evenings. Very apt indeed. At 7 at Lillycroft Primary, I was chosen to sing a solo verse in the carol In the Deep Midwinter. As I innocently started the verse, I was astonished to see the heads of the watching parents jerk up suddenly from their programmes and listen in rapt attention. It was my first taste of power over an audience, and I loved it. Nor have I forgotten my earliest night of stage triumph in Insect Play, performed at Bradford Girls' Grammar School circa 1966, in which I was playing the lead role of the tramp. I'd not told anyone in rehearsal, least of all the form mistress who directed the play, but I had a secret prop that I intended to use in one scene, which I started with a long monologue. The lights went up, and I strolled to the front of the stage. The audience coughed and rustled expectantly. I took out a pipe and matches, items I'd secretly borrowed from my father, from my pocket, and proceeded to light up. The reaction was as expected. Shocked gasps of mingled horror and amusement erupted. I was vaguely aware of angry hissings in the wings, no doubt from the drama mistress invoking me to cease, but I was relishing the moment too much to pay any attention. Where I got the boldness from I shall never know, but it was the talking point of the school for days. I was well on the way to pursuing the secret ambition I'd nurtured since the age of 6, that of becoming an actress. At the age of 11, I joined the Bradford Civic Playhouse and Film Theatre, a semi-professional outfit where I'd already performed in several plays. At 17, I appeared as Juliet in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, but we were mangled by the local press. The headline of the notice read, "Where was the passion?" It stung somewhat at the time, but I was young and resilient, and besides, they were holding auditions for the West Riding Youth Theatre, into which I was accepted, and where I was urged to try for the leading female role in the Scottish play. I didn't get it, and ended up playing one of the witches as well as the gentlewoman, but these early disappointments were a good lesson for what was to come later, when I would enter a profession notorious for its ups and downs. I won the Best Actress Award in the Bradford Drama Festival a year later, presented to me by Alan Ayckbourn no less, so that went some way to soothing my damaged ego. Also, during my teenage years, I joined another amateur drama group, rather pretentiously named Group Theatre, after the famous New York establishment founded by Lee Strasberg. I rubbed shoulders with older members, students from Manchester University, Hull and Rose Bruford, all doing what I wanted to do, study drama. Some of these went on to achieve huge success. Barry Hansen, producer of The Long Good Friday, Stephanie Turner, who played the lead in Juliet Bravo, and actors Duncan Preston, Edward Peel and Polly Hemingway. I was totally in awe of this glamorous bunch of individuals and had to keep pinching myself to make sure I wasn't dreaming. Needless to say, I learnt a great deal about my craft on those Wednesday evenings when we gathered in a couple of dingy rooms above a glazier's shop on Toller Lane. We would launch into Stanislavski improvisations, gleamed from his books on acting, which were like Bibles to us. These sessions would sometimes last literally for hours, and I would stagger out totally exhausted and exhilarated to catch the trolley bus home. We produced plays too, which we performed at Bradford University. My favourite role was as the witch in Wood Painting, a superb Ingmar Bergman play, which I saw a very good production of years later. My goal at 16 was to train at RADA, which I secretly applied to and was accepted by, having sneaked down to London for the auditions shortly after my 17th birthday. I'd written to John Fernald, the then principal, some years earlier, and had received a lovely letter from him containing wise advice. However, as my family were not well off, I now needed a grant if I was to go there, and this was refused by the local council, who pointed out, quite rightly, that I was already a grant recipient at Bradford Girls' Grammar School, where I'd won a scholarship. They insisted that I stay on to do my A-levels, which I did with gritted teeth and passed with flying colours. Miss Black had softened towards me over the years, being, as I was, a first-class English student. She insisted that I try for Oxbridge. Rather immaturely, I'd never forgotten her humiliation of me all those years ago, and so determinedly thwarted her, and applied to Bristol instead, where I got a place to do English and drama, just to see if I could. I did not go, but reapplied to and was accepted by the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art. Miss Black stood in her usual position at the front of the stage, and announced my achievement to the entire assembly. It was a proud moment. Then she gave her customary nod to the pianist to play the marching out music, saw that it was me — piano students took it in turns to play at assembly — and actually gave me a huge wink. I nearly fell off my stool with surprise, and to this day wonder if I'd imagined it, but our peace was made. Many girls left the sixth form on our last day at school in tears, but I bounded out of the school gates for the last time with a huge grin on my face, throwing my detested dark blue berry into the school pond as I passed, running with certainty to a future long imagined, now real. My new life as a drama student was about to begin, and I couldn't wait. Chapter 4, 1968, London. It was now the summer of 1968, and the new RADA intake was not till January 1969. I had several months to fill and elected to go down to London to stay with my sister and find a job. Tina had moved down several years earlier and was working as a fashion designer for Marks and Spencer. I had visited her previously when I was 14 and had a taste of the excitements of the capital city, staying at the house she was sharing. My poor mother had been in a state of nerves as she saw me off at the station on my first journey alone, and was actually knocked over by a slow-moving car as we disembarked from our taxi. Luckily she was okay and none the worse for her trauma, but I had to get on the train in a state of high anxiety. To make matters worse, I'd forgotten my suitcase in the brouhaha that had followed Mum's accident, and arrived at the other end with only the clothes I was dressed in. Needless to say, Tina's extensive and up-to-the-minute wardrobe proved more than an adequate compensation. The week was very exciting and proved to me beyond doubt that London was where I wanted to live when I'd finally left the confines of my birthplace. My first mission was to find a job, my second, a place to live, as I did not want to impose on my newlywed kin for too long. My sister had recently married. I'd been her bridesmaid, and I was sleeping on a sofa in her tiny one-bedroom flat in Olympia. I applied myself assiduously to the back pages of the Evening Standard, the Bible for London life, where both jobs and flat share ads were arrayed over several sides of newspaper. So many entries. Where to start? I was assured that Mayfair was a very nice area, so applied for a job in Brook Street at a market research firm. My luck was in, and I started right away. Mind you, the job was not exactly high-flying. I was to be a general dog's body to all the directors, and spent my days scanning pie charts and questionnaires, then totting up scores with the aid of 5-bar gates. I'd no idea what the latter meant, until a kindly colleague explained that it was simply a method of counting. I would draw a little vertical stick for, say, every yes answer on the questionnaire, and after 4 sticks alongside one another, I would strike a diagonal bar through them, hence forming the gate. Ingenious. It meant, of course, that I only needed to multiply the gates by 5, terribly easily, to reach the hundreds. I was intrigued at this clever little method of ready reckoning. Bradford girls' grammar had never taught me anything remotely as practical. The MD of the company, hearing of my housing predicament, very kindly offered me his little place in Belgravia while he was away on business for a few weeks. He'd been looking for a house-sitter, so would I be interested? Would I ever? I delightfully accepted, knowing I would never get another chance to reside in such a swanky area, and still haven't to this day. The house was in Ebury Street, and was a 4-story giant as opposed to the small abode that the head honcho had intimated it to be. It was filled with the most exquisite antiques and priceless-looking paintings. I was overwhelmed, but soon got over it, and shortly afterwards started inviting family and friends round for dinner parties. They were highly impressed, and like me, handled the expensive-looking china and cutlery gingerly, afraid of inflicting any damage. All was going well until a week before the owner was due to return. I was dusting in the study when I noticed, to my horror, a pile of china fragments on the floor. I looked closely and discerned a Chinese pattern on the pieces. It looked like it had been a large platter and had probably hung on the wall. The study had not been a room I'd been into often. I had not hitherto noticed its adornments and was merely cleaning in anticipation of my boss coming back from abroad. What to do? I hovered over the pieces, feeling more and more helpless and obscurely guilty. Finally, I scooped them up into a newspaper and left them in the hallway. That night, I crept out under the cover of darkness and deposited them in a dustbin 2 streets away. I went to bed, satisfied that the owner would never notice. He had so much stuff, was he likely to miss a plate? As I asked myself this question, the answer terrifyingly presented itself. What if the plate was not just any old piece of tap, but something of great value, like, say, a piece of Sèvres china? I sat bolt upright, my heart racing, dressed and scuttled round to the dustbin. Whew! The newspaper and its contents were still there. Feeling like a criminal, I bundled the evidence under my coat and let myself back into the house. I deposited the broken artifact back into a pile of pieces on the study floor, shut the door, and tried to forget all about it. Admittedly, I had a few hairy days after the MD returned, and kept expecting him to call me into his office, but nothing happened. Presumably he'd seen the breakage, and like me had assumed it had fallen off the wall. I fervently hope to this day it was not Ming. My accommodation situation was resolved when I applied for and got a flat share in Notting Hill. Not the trendy village it is nowadays, but rather a seedy slum in places. I joined 4 other girls on the 4th floor of a tall townhouse in Clanricarde Gardens and settled into my little room, more of a cell actually, feeling very grown-up and happy. I also discovered the fascinating quarters of Notting Hill on my weekend strolls and stumbled across a street market one day in Portobello Road, where I spent hours browsing through the stalls. One Saturday, while rummaging around a second-hand fur coat store, the owner, a huge, swarthy chap, eyed me up and then asked me bluntly if I'd like to work for him. I was taken aback at first and then thought, why not? It could be a nice Saturday job for me, and the extra £5 a week would come in handy. I took off my coat and started right away. The work was fun, as the market was a magnet for the hippies and artistic types of London, who were all looking for original tat with which to adorn themselves. The coats on the store were tattier than most. Some were actually moth-eaten, but as this was the look of the moment, the stall did a roaring trade, and we were busy from dawn till dusk. 1968 was such an exciting and memorable year for me. The end of the swinging 60s was nearing, and flower power was at its height. I was in the thick of it, especially as we often went along to listen to bands at the Roundhouse, a great rock venue in those days, where we heard and danced along to mind-blowing acts including Cream, Pink Floyd, The Who, Traffic, Pretty Things, and Family. During this time, I became especially close to a drummer in the band called Steamhammer, Mike Rushton. His big brother Tony was a director on Private Eye, the stellar satirical mag of the day. His cousin was the comic and writer Willie Rushton. Mike and I became an item and moved in together into a Notting Hill bedsit, only slightly larger than my tiny cell round the corner had been. Mike left Steamhammer in 1969, but the band continued, and some went on to great heights, notably Martin Quittenton, the guitarist, who later co-wrote Maggie May with Rod Stewart. Our affair lasted for about a year. I gave in my notice at the Market Research Company, to the great chagrin of the MD, who told me sadly that I'd been due for a promotion. I nearly confessed then to my crime, still feeling that the shattered plate was somehow my fault, but forbore, and started at RADA in January 1969. From then on, my days were concentrated on learning. There was little room for anything else. Mike was often away touring with the band, and we grew apart. The first serious relationship of my life came to a close. Chapter 5, 1969, RADA. The tip of the tongue, the top of the teeth. Pa's car is a Jaguar, and Pa drives rather fast. These vocal exercises were just a small round of the daily curriculum at RADA, which we began by clocking in, factory style, onto a notice board typed with all the students' names, watched by a gimlet-eyed uniformed porter simply known as Bosun. His colleague, a slightly more sympathetic individual, was called Captain. This formidable pair manned the front portals of the hallowed establishment, and brooked no excuses from latecomers as they flew in breathlessly with the same lame excuses that the two old ex-mariners must have heard 1,000 times before. "My train was late. I overslept. I couldn't find any clean knickers." Each outburst elicited the same response, a stony glare, pursed lips, maybe a brief and then a brisk scrawl in the black book, noting the recalcitrant student's name. If you were late more than twice, you were hauled up before the principal. More than 3 times, and you were expelled. A harsh regime, but deemed necessary to teach us the absolute and supreme tenet of being a thespian. Never, ever be late. I don't know anyone who trained at RADA who's not scrupulously punctual. The early days at the academy were the happiest I'd ever known. A daily, gruelling round of classes, movement, dance, fencing, text reading, voice, and of course diction. The tongue twisters we had to practice every day were especially difficult for us northerners, of whom there were quite a few. We found it particularly hard to master the long R, as in Pa's car is a Jaguar, and were constantly ridiculed by the voice teachers, who were sometimes cruel in the extreme. It was all water off a duck's back to me, though, inured as I was to feeling different and being mocked for it, but there were often emotional scenes in the girls' locker room, where it seemed as if someone was always in floods of tears at some time or another. But I was in 7th heaven. I loved the hard work and discipline, and the first term flew by. I was now sharing a flat in Hampstead with a fellow student, a girl from Liverpool by the name of Sharon Mugan, or Morn as she later became. I could not afford furniture, but had purloined some orange boxes and had balanced boards of varying sizes on top to make a bed and tables. This bright idea was borrowed from the refugees back in Bradford, who'd all furnished their meagre lodgings in this way when they first arrived in England. Mike, only just still on the scene, gave me a hand with painting the Eve bedroom in orange and yellow. Psychedelia was still alive and kicking, especially in North London. Being a drama student had its perks, free tickets to London theatres being one. We eagerly attended each and every performance we could, and for the first time in my life I saw the best of my future profession tread the boards in the West End, with me watching and learning all the while. We were also extremely privileged as RADA students to attend the brains trusts that were laid on for us when prominent figures were invited to come and talk about their lives in the acting profession and to answer questions. The most memorable of these occasions was when Steve McQueen visited, overawing us all as he gave advice on working in the film industry, an avenue of work none of us had really ever considered, our tuition being geared as it was to the stage only. His presence was magical, exuding that quite rare and elusive essence, star quality. His eyes were the most mesmeric and startling bright blue, his voice low and melodic. We strained forward to catch every syllable that he uttered, quite besotted. Only later did we learn that he was almost profoundly deaf and was cleverly lip-reading the questions we put to him. Perhaps the most magnetically attractive human being I've ever met was Richard Burton. I was in my second year at RADA, and now going out with an actor whom I'd met while he was still a student there. He was acting in a film called Villain, in which Richard Burton was playing the menacing title role. The filming was taking place in London. One morning my boyfriend Stephen rang to ask me if I'd care to visit the set, as they were having a slow day. Would I ever? I arrived at the location, a gambling casino off Curzon Street, clutching a Tesco carrier bag, which was the only handbag I could afford at the time. The grant from Bradford Town Council paid me £6 a week to live on, actually quite a generous sum for those days. I had made some effort with my appearance, though, donning slinky black velvet bell-bottoms and a mustard flower-printed top, which I'd found in a rummage stall on the Portobello Road. Very stylish, I thought, albeit held together with safety pins. I nervously entered the room off the main casino where Burton sat with his entourage and was introduced. As I leaned forward to shake his hand, I noticed too late that my top safety pin had come undone, revealing my cleavage. The great man's first words to me were, "Nice chest." I suppose this would be considered politically incorrect today, but I was thrilled to bits. I perched tentatively at the edge of his coterie of 12 or so persons. Who were they all? And proceeded to worship. Richard was a one-man show, regaling us with long, rambling stories of the films he'd made, the actors he'd worked with, and, of course, Elizabeth Taylor, whom he referred to as Liz. Liz! I'd never imagined that I would ever hear that screen legend referred to by such a casual epithet in my presence. The morning wore on, Richard popping off every now and then to do a short scene, mainly with his co-star, the wonderful Ian McShane, and coming back to refill his glass from the whisky bottle on the table before him. Stories of his drink consumption were legendary, of course, and after witnessing the goings-on in the bar of the Estonian Club, I did not even bat an eyelid, but this man remained stone-cold sober, glass after glass, never pausing in his fluent and fascinating monologue. I'd never seen or heard the like. He referred to his prolific alcohol consumption himself, launching into a particularly amusing description of one of his drinking sprees, adding in an ear-splitting bellow, "But Liz drank every man under the table!" I was impressed, sitting there primly sipping my lemonade. I'd long ago given up my childhood vodka habit. Perhaps it should be resumed. Lunch break arrived, and a couple of his entourage disappeared. We were still a stalwart bunch of 10 or so, however, and followed him as he led the way through the streets of Mayfair to the Dorchester Hotel on Park Lane, where he had a suite of rooms at his disposal, like the crowd following Jesus into Jerusalem. Here, a minion ordered sandwiches from room service for us all, and the master raconteur resumed his tales. More acolytes melted away, and we were now 5. Richard gazed at me reflectively. "Would you like to see Elizabeth Swiggs?" I thought he'd invited me to the premiere of a movie entitled Elizabeth Swiggs, possibly the story of a woman with a drink problem, and said, "Yes, please." He sprang to his feet and led me to the bedroom suite, followed by the troupe, naturally, and there, sure enough, was an array of beautiful dark hairpieces, all skillfully dressed and displayed on a huge shelf unit that stretched from floor to ceiling. There must have been at least 30 or so. "Try one on," Richard boomed. My mind boggled. Try on one of Elizabeth Taylor's wigs? It was unthinkable. I stammered a lame excuse and was saved from further prompting with a knock on the door from room service. We traipsed back to the film set, hung around till 6 or so, and met up with Richard again when his day had ended. "So, what are you kids up to now?" he inquired. We kids agreed very promptly that we were up to nothing. "Jump in the car and let's see what the evening brings." Richard's entourage was down to 2 now. One of them, a striking, tall black guy, turned out to be his driver, and he brought the most magnificent white Rolls-Royce round to the front of the casino. We climbed in, trying very hard to look as if this was the sort of thing that happened to us every day, me still clutching my Tesco bag, and off we purred. Eventually, having dropped off the last disciple, we found ourselves in Fulham, coincidentally not far from where we lived, and Richard spotted a shop on the corner. "Fish and chips!" he roared. "I love fish and chips! Let's get some fish and chips!" The car pulled up outside, drawing curious stares from the passers-by. The driver went in to buy our supper, while Richard learned of the convenient proximity of our flat. "Let's go there," he announced. So finally, at the end of what was probably the most surreally bizarre and wonderfully exciting day of my life, I crossed the threshold of my modest flat in Fulham, with a Tesco's carrier bag in one hand, a bag of fish and chips in the other, and Richard Burton trailing behind. Now it was just the 3 of us, and still the novelty of being in the company of one of the world's greatest film stars had not worn off. If anything, his presence, larger than life, being now concentrated on just the 2 of us, was even more beguiling, and we were transfixed, mesmerised, seduced, overwhelmed and totally charmed by this wonderful, wonderful man, eating fish and chips with us in our humble home. Now his audience was smaller, he too became quieter, reflecting on his childhood in Wales and offering snippets of advice to us on our future in the acting business. It was fascinating. The evening ended. Richard smacked his lips, stood, stared at me reflectively for the 2nd time that day, and growled to no one in particular, "Bind her to you with bands of steel," and left. The next day, we received a telegram which read, "Dear both, thank you for the divine fish and chips. If I was outrageous, it is my natural way of life, but anything nasty I may have said was not meant, and anything nice was in vino veritas. Affectionately, Richard Burton." I have it to this day, and will treasure it for always. My RADA course was drawing inexorably to a close. The time had gone so quickly. Over the duration of 2.5 years, I'd learned, among many other things, how to use a fan in restoration comedy, fight with a sword, throw my voice to the back of a theatre, even in a whisper, and most importantly, how to speak in RP, that is, received pronunciation, which is standard English to the rest of the world. I'd lost my Yorkshire accent at last. I'd played Hermia in A Midsummer Night's Dream, Miranda in The Tempest, and Marianne in La Malade Imaginaire, and I'd made some firm and lifelong friends. Sharon Morn, from the Nescafe Gold Blend commercials, Sherry Hewson from Coronation Street, and Louise Jameson, who was to appear in a certain sci-fi programme many years later. Sharon and I decided to join a temping agency during our 2nd summer break. We needed to work in the holidays, as our grants were only paid during the teaching terms. I'd previously tried waitressing, but perhaps a new venture would be more exciting. My first job was as a shorthand typist. I'd never even seen a typewriter, let alone used one, but being the eternal optimist, I thought to myself, well, how difficult could it be? I soon found out as I was ushered into a city office and asked to take a letter, Miss Tamm. My boss started to dictate. He paused at the end of the sentence and asked kindly, "Did you get that?" I paused in my task of looking for the D of "Dear Sir" and said brightly, Not quite. Could you run it past me again?" He crossed the room and looked over my shoulder. The game was up. My next job was as a tea lady. A bit of an extinct animal nowadays, having been replaced by the vending machine, but a well-loved figure, an integral part of office life back then. All went well until I reached the manager's office. I knocked, and a voice told me to enter. I wrestled with the door, which was on a kind of a spring and seemed not to want to open. I huffed and puffed, shouldering my way through, half pushing, half dragging the heavy trolley the while, and tried to manoeuvre myself and all my paraphernalia into the room. Unfortunately, I had not noticed the protruding plinth at my feet, and I watched in horror as the trolley tilted and the tea urn slid, seemingly in slow motion, inexorably south. There was a horrible crash as urn, tea, cups, saucers, spoons and buns clattered to the floor. My first impulse was to snigger nervously, an impulse I unwisely gave way to. This did not go down too well with the manager, who barked at me to bloody well clear the mess up. As I did so, he asked me why I tried to push the trolley into the room in the first place. Mrs. B, the usual tea lady, only popped her head round the door to take his order and then brought it in from outside. That struck me too late as a sensible idea. I mopped the floor, reflecting that every job, no matter how menial, required its own particular finesse. As I was fired, I thought what a pity it was I'd not discovered the particular foibles of tea-serving early enough. I realised that office work was not for me, and returned to waitressing instead, which I became surprisingly good at. It was better paid, too, as my new employment was at Borsch and Cheers, a fashionable restaurant in Beecham Place. I made quite a healthy sum, especially as the tips were very generous, and deposited my earnings into the Bank of Greece on Tottenham Court Road, just around the corner from RADA. Tired, but richer than I'd ever been, I returned to the academy for the autumn term, which passed in a flash. The end-of-course prizes were announced, and I was gratified to learn I'd won two. One, the Emil Littler, was for excellence and professionalism, while the second, the Hannam Clark, was for dialect. The latter had been gained in a competition, judged by Jonathan Miller, in which I'd recited Edward Lear's The Owl and the Pussycat, first in an Irish accent, then Yorkshire. What else? And then it was the finals. I was to play Elizabeth Proctor in Arthur Miller's The Crucible. I stood at the front of the stage on the last night, taking my bow with the rest of the cast, and wondered what the future would bring. Chapter 6. 1971. So far, everything had gone to plan. I'd been to the best school in Bradford, trained at the world's leading theatre academy, and now was impatient for my first job in the professional theatre. But it did not come. The end of the final RADA term had been in the spring, and now summer was almost halfway through. My fellow students had all gained employment, some in rep, some at the prestigious national companies, and others in television. I was the only one still unemployed. I'd procured a job as a waitress at a hamburger joint on the King's Road, working 2 shifts a day, and spent my paltry free time dragging my feet, figuratively and literally, along the paths of Hyde Park. After a few weeks of this, I was unexpectedly promoted to manageress. I was thrilled in a way, as it meant more money, but also depressed that my career seemed to be blossoming in a direction I'd not anticipated. Perhaps I was fated to continue in the catering business, so bleak were my prospects of employment in the path I'd chosen for myself. The new job involved more work and responsibility, and though interaction with the public somewhat lightened my mood, it was humdrum in the extreme. It was swelteringly hot that year. On one of my walks through the park, I sat down in the shade of a tree and opened my copy of The Stage, the seasoned actor's standby, the back pages of which detailed any jobs that were going. My eyes fell on an advert for the new Birmingham Repertory Company, looking for actors and singers for the opening of not only a new season, but a brand new theatre. The date for open auditions was today. I sprang to my feet hurriedly, hopped onto a bus and headed for the West End. With no music and no song prepared, it was going to be fairly hairy, but I had a couple of strong audition pieces up my sleeve, and besides, I was desperate. My luck was in. The auditions were being taken by Peter Dews, a fellow Yorkshireman, who'd had a phenomenal success with An Age of Kings, a series of Shakespeare's history plays, brilliantly directed and adapted for television. He was practically a household name, and now the artistic director of the new theatre. My song, Frank Mills from Hair, went okay, even without accompaniment, probably because I'd not had enough time to even think about getting nervous, and the speeches were fine. I left having acquitted myself well, and without having to introduce our common ground for a sympathy vote. I called a couple of actor friends when I got home, and they were very pleased and happy for me, and also impressed. Did I realise how prestigious it would be to get into the new Birmingham Rep Company, where in the old theatre the likes of Laurence Olivier and Paul Schofield had trodden the boards? No, I obviously didn't. Just as well, because knowing how important this new company was going to be beforehand would have sent me into a flat spin, and I would have blown it. As it happened, I hadn't, and a couple of days later I received a letter telling me I'd been accepted. I was to start in September, and my contract would last for 9 months, exactly the duration of work required to qualify for a full equity card. Very hard to get in those days. I was off! Much later, when I got to know Peter better, he confessed to me that his mother-in-law, who'd seen me in the production of Romeo and Juliet at the Civic Theatre, had made him promise to employ that girl if it's the last thing you do. End of Part 1. Part 2. Chapter 7. Birmingham Rep. The year was 1971, and in those days Brum was not the exciting and vibrant second city of England that it is now. In fact, it was considered a bit of a dump. The town centre consisted of the town hall and the new Birmingham Repertory Theatre, which was a modern rotunda of a building dominated by a semicircular swathe of windows. I thought it was wonderful. In fact, the whole city impressed me, coming as I did from an even bigger dump further north, and I was never depressed by the environment as some of my fellow actors were. The production chosen to open the new theatre was, appropriately enough, called First Impressions, a musical version of Pride and Prejudice, containing such numbers as 5 daughters, how did it happen? So not an altogether serious slant on the book, but faithful to the story nevertheless. Darcy was played by Frances Matthews, and the Bennet daughters included Cheryl Kennedy and Gemma Craven. My part was as a member of the chorus, hoofing around enthusiastically and singing along to swell the numbers. Those long days of learning movement and music at drama school had not been wasted. I also understudied Cheryl, who was playing Elizabeth. Alas, I never did go on for her, but had many gruelling rehearsals to attend for the role, and a couple of nerve-wracking scares when she had a sore throat. Another musical followed, Good Time Johnny, a rollicking Victorian romp which featured 2 of my comedy heroes, Ronnie Barker and Joan Sims. It's difficult to remember with any acuity how starstruck I felt in those days, meeting and working with actors I'd known all my life from the small and large screens. I pretty soon became somewhat blasé about the whole thing and accepted the ethic of the company zeitgeist. But to start with, I had to keep pinching myself to be reminded just how lucky I was to be living my dream. Ronnie was the most wonderful man. Very, very funny, unlike some comics who can be downright morose when not performing, and totally natural with everyone. He was a great tease and had nicknames for us all. When I ran into him many years later at a showbiz do, he greeted me warmly with, "Och, the new Miss Tamm." Joan was wonderful too, and invited me to tea many times when I eventually returned to London, as coincidentally we discovered that we lived on the same street in Fulham. She in a beautiful 4-storey house, and me in a grubby little bedsit. She had some hugely amusing tales to relate of her carry-on days, and regaled me for hours on end, often doing very accurate impressions of her fellow performers. She was a real sweetie, and a great comedy actress. I feel immensely privileged to have known her and Ronnie. Other productions followed, with parts that became bigger and bigger, until I ended up playing Sarah in Pinter's The Lover, with Derek Jacobi as the milkman. It was very generous of him to appear in The Lover, as the milkman only had a brief appearance, which was when my character opened the door to his. I'm afraid to say I had my first experience of corpsing during this very short scene, laughing to you non-thesps, as his delivery of one short line, consisting merely of the question, "Cream?" was lengthened and rolled round his mouth so lasciviously and suggestively, his eyes twinkling the while, it had me heaving helplessly every time. I never once got through the scene without the greatest difficulty. One of the most memorable experiences of this time, or indeed my life, was the curtain call for the first night of the double bill, when Derek swept to the front of the stage to take his bow. We were all ringed round him in a semicircle, and witnessed the audience rise to its feet for a standing ovation. It was something I've never ever forgotten, as 1,000 people in unison showed their appreciation for this truly great actor. He deserved every decibel. All too soon, though, my time at Birmingham drew to an end. I had my full equity card, which meant I could now work on TV and in film, options which at the time I never considered, strangely enough, given that the next 20 years of my career were to be almost exclusively dominated by these mediums. I was between agents and reading the stage avidly again, hoping for more open auditions, when I heard of a film role being cast. This was through the famous casting director Mary Selway, to whom I'd written and who'd invited me to ring her up. I called from a phone box down the road from my Fulham bedsit and arranged to go and meet her at Shepperton Studios for a reading. After taking several buses and trains, I arrived at Shepperton on a wet, windy and dark autumn afternoon. I found myself in a small room and read the script for Mary and the director, Freddie Francis, who was better known as a director of photography, or DP. I had no aspirations at this time to become a film starlet, as my dreams had always been of treading the boards, but several people had urged me to try this route, and I was easily led. They must have been right, as I got the part, and filming commenced one dreary January morning, when a large limo picked me up from my bedsit to take me to Shepperton. The journey was not auspicious, as the limo was nearly driven off the road by a speeding sports car, which suddenly swerved out of control in front of us on the M4, crashed into the grassy bank at the side of the road and burst into flames. Luckily the driver was okay, but his car was a write-off. The omens continued. Later that morning, whilst filming on location, my caravan caught fire. Although quickly extinguished, the flames destroyed a rather fabulous corduroy trouser suit which I'd bought from Bieber. Was I miffed? That suit had cost me 3 months' wages from Brum. However, every cloud has a silver lining, as Bridget Sellers, the costume designer, took it upon herself to go and buy me another one in black velvet, the smartest item I'd ever owned, and which proved very lucky for me, as you'll hear later. Tales That Witness Madness was a horror film which has now become a cult classic. It consisted of 4 stories linked by the common theme of a lunatic asylum, the proprietor of which was Donald Pleasance, with Jack Hawkins as his sidekick, both the most charming of men. My meeting with these 2 screen legends was very brief, however, as I had no scenes with them. The 4 tales were rather fantastical, to say the least, and the main protagonists all ended up in the aforesaid mental institution because of traumatic experiences in their lives. In my tale, in which I played an innocent virgin called Ginny, my mother went mad when she learned that I'd been cooked and eaten at a Hawaiian luau or feast in which she'd participated. Yes, an everyday story of simple folk. Originally, the screen goddess Rita Hayworth had been cast in the role of the mother, and it was to be her big screen comeback. I met her for the first time one chilly January morning, when I was taken to her caravan and introduced. She greeted us with her still gorgeously red hair in rollers, and was absolutely beguiling, as well as stunningly beautiful, with those amazingly chiselled cheekbones still dominating her face. However, she had the beginnings of the cruel disease of Alzheimer's, which killed her eventually, poor woman, and found after a couple of days that she simply could not cope with learning the lines, and so flew back to LA. Being the callow youth that I was then, I worried that this would mean my part would have to be recast. I'd already had my hair dyed a deep auburn, so that Rita and I would look like blood relatives, and although my naturally dark brown tresses looked very pretty with this new colour, I thought it a pity to have wasted the 4 hours at Leonard's, the top hairdresser in London then, only to be dismissed and paid off. After a couple of days, I learned that Kim Novak was to take over, and that I was still on board as her daughter. I gulped with relief, and then a new thought struck me. Crumbs, was I now to go blonde? Luckily, this was not mooted, but the producer, Norman Priggin, took me aside and told me that if Kim asked, I was only 18, right? I was 21, and wondered innocently why I was to lie about my age. Again, the naivety of youth prevailing, and I was more naive than most. It was only years later, when I was a woman of a certain age myself, that I realised that such women do not wish to be seen to have grown-up daughters, even if only on screen. Kim Novak was very impressive. She really should have had no concerns about her age, for she still looked fabulously youthful and very beautiful. She was tall and had a graceful way of moving her hands when she spoke in that deep, melodious voice of hers. I was completely awestruck. Learning the new discipline of filming was eye-opening and required a great deal of hard work and concentration. It was so absolutely different to stage work, and everything I'd learned at RADA and Brum now had to be thrown out the window. The part I was playing was a very good one, and I'd plenty to get my teeth into. One of the many perks of being a film starlet in those days was the constant stream of invites to parties and film premieres. One was picked up and chauffeured not only to the West End to view the film, but afterwards to a glamorous do, often at the Dorchester, where I remember a particularly lively ball at which Eric Morecambe cut in on my dancing partner and whirled me off in a flurry of skirts and coat-tails. I said nothing, and Eric, who was surprisingly handsome at close quarters, merely said, "Red sky at night, shepherd's cottage on fire." After this enigmatic sentence, he dropped me off with my escort again and disappeared into the throng. What a card! My life had progressed a long, long way since Bradford, but little did I know I was destined to return to the north again soon. Chapter 8, 1973, The Donati Conspiracy. By a strange coincidence, the location for Tales That Witness Madness was also one of the locations for my next job, a 3-part series for the BBC called The Donati Conspiracy. It was a million miles away in plot credibility from Witness Madness, however, with a brilliant script written by John Gould and described as a contemporary thriller series set in a parallel Britain where the country is ruled by a fascist dictatorship. In the wake of the recent IRA bombing of the Old Bailey, it struck a dark chord. I was playing opposite the late, great Richard Beckinsale, playing a straight part for a change, and very good he was in it too. He was a lovely and easy actor to work with, and we had a lot of scenes together as we were playing boyfriend and girlfriend. Our characters were students who were uncovering a sinister government plot, which spookily had many parallels to the student movement of the day. The Paris riots had only recently occurred, and the undergraduates from London University and the LSE, London School of Economics, were protesting against government policy. Richard and I were often thrown together during breaks in rehearsals, when we strolled across to a graveyard opposite the BBC rehearsal rooms to practice our lines, and discuss what we used to refer to in Bradford as life, death and diarrhea. Life, death, and why you're here. It was immensely poignant later to recall these conversations when I heard of his tragically early demise, which was such a huge and shocking loss to the acting profession. The BBC at that time had a tower block in West London consisting of floor upon floor of rehearsal rooms with a canteen on the top level, affectionately referred to by all who worked there as the Acton Hilton. Nowadays we poor thesps do not have the luxury of rehearsal for telly, but are thrown in at the deep end on day one of filming in front of the cameras and required to be DLP, dead letter perfect, in other words, knowing all your lines beforehand. Then we had 10 days to rehearse an hour-long episode, which meant a more thorough exploration of the text and time to try out each scene in a number of different ways. It also meant, of course, that you were not up late for nights on end, trying desperately to learn all the lines, having the benefit of knowing that they would simply sink in by repetition and a kind of osmosis, helped by plotting the moves at leisure. The location filming was usually done beforehand and played back in the studio when the episode was recorded on the Sunday after the rehearsal period. The gorgeous Anthony Valentine was also in the series, he of the impossibly sexy and mellifluous vocal cords, who's engaged our aural senses over the years in many a commercial voiceover, and possibly the man with the most beautiful voice in the world. I remember him literally taking hold of me and physically turning my face to the studio monitors to view the playback of my own performance and exhorting me to watch and learn. I was somewhat embarrassed by this attention, having, as I did, a bit of a crush on him, but he was right. I know many actors, myself included, who hate watching themselves on screen, but you really do have to endure the torture and be as objective as you can about your own performance to improve. Also, filming for the small screen is different to filming for the big one. I had imagined that, having completed my first feature, telly would be a doddle, but this was not the case. In the studio, different cameras filmed from different angles, and you had to be aware of where they were and which one was on at all times. Not easy. The Donati Conspiracy was a great success and received well by audiences and critics alike. I was very proud to be a part of it. I packed my bags and took the train to Manchester to join the cast of A Raging Calm, a new TV series in which I was to feature in several episodes. Stan Barstow, that gritty northern novelist, is perhaps best known for his 1960 novel A Kind of Loving, which has long been used as a set text in British schools and which has been variously translated into a movie, a television series, a radio play and a stage play. He adapted his work, A Raging Calm, for the TV series and attended rehearsals, which is always a great help for information on one's character. Manchester was a great city in which to live and work, and is still one of my favourite places in the world. I stayed there for several months, not returning to London even at weekends, as the nightlife up north was far better. I went out on the town with various cast members and became friendly with the locals. The most memorable of these was George Best, who was a good pal of a fellow actor on the series, Tommy Boyle. We had one particular night which started out at George's nightclub and ended up in a pub crawl around the various drinking holes of the city, finishing up in a highly dubious establishment at 7 a.m. the next morning. I was convinced we were in a house of ill repute, although the boys tried hard to persuade me otherwise. George was a very sweet, quiet and polite guy. I was quite a football fan and thought him to be the best, pun intended, player on the planet. I still do. I was quite sad to return to London when the filming was over, as Manchester had become like a home to me. It's not always the case on long trips away. Usually actors can't wait to get back and look for their next job after location filming, but something clicked for me there, maybe because of the northern connections again. Back with my nose to the grindstone, more series leads followed, including parts in Public Eye with Alfred Burke, Hunter's Walk, and The Inheritors with Peter Egan. All enriching experiences, with many lessons learned. Chapter 9, 1973, Coronation Street. My casting on Corrie had come about by a strange twist of fate. The director, Roland Joffe, who was later to helm The Killing Fields and The Mission, had taught me at RADA, where we did the Greeks in Term 5. He directed me as Jocasta in Oedipus, a fabulous part if ever there was one, and which I enjoyed doing very much, especially for Roland, who was just terrific to work with and very thorough in exploring the text. This knowledge and experience of the play had later helped me enormously in the Birmingham Rep production. Now he was in Manchester, having just done the television director's course at Granada, which, along with the Beebs, was considered to be the best in the country. He was casting the part of Polly Ogden, daughter-in-law to Hilda and Stan, no less, and had very kindly thought of me. I was very, very excited about this new venture, having watched The Street avidly since episode 1, although I was only to appear in 2 episodes and was in Manchester just for a week. Although what a week it was to be, I had yet no idea. The rehearsal rooms, though not as vast as those at the BBC, were on several floors in the Granada building on Key Street, and I rode the lift up in some trepidation, rather nervous of meeting my new family and other members of the cast. I needn't have worried a jot, as they were all absolutely wonderful, warm and welcoming and down to earth. I especially liked Doris Speed, who, of course, played the inimitable Annie Walker, landlady of the Rover's Return. I had imagined she would be as stern and frosty as her character, but no, she wasn't at all. The biggest surprise was her voice, though. She had no trace whatsoever of the accent and delivery of her character, but spoke perfect Queen's English. What a revelation! My part was a lovely one, and I had lots of scenes with the two actors who portrayed the Ogdens, Jean Alexander and Bernard Ewins. Jean again was a revelation, as, like Doris, she was so terribly nice and spoke with the RP that was so different to her character's uncouth speech. My character was posh, which I certainly found quite difficult to do, as, despite my rather training, I still did not find the standard English accent came to me naturally, especially when surrounded by all those flat northern vowels. Consequently, the odd Yorkshire ah or oh would intrude. 2 weeks prior to my job in Corrie, I'd met another very famous casting director, Jenny Reiser. She'd asked me to come in to read for the part of a German girl, Siggy, in a new project, the big screen version of the Odessa by Frederick Forsyth. Because of my bilingual upbringing and consequent early facility for languages, I'd learnt German at school. My grasp of the language was helped by the fact that I'd heard it a lot at home, too. My parents, who spoke 13 languages between them, often lapsed into German when they did not want the kids to understand what they were saying. As a result, I think we picked up more than they realised. So, when Jenny was looking for German-speaking actors, my name came up, although my agent, Roger Carey, warned me that they were also going to Hamburg to look for the real thing, and would probably cast there as they wanted the film, which was set in Germany, to look and sound as authentic as possible. I'd been to the casting in my new black velvet suit, which had replaced the one destroyed in the caravan fire, and met Ronald Neame, the director, who had also directed such wonderful films as Tunes of Glory and The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. Incredibly, he'd also co-written the screenplay for Brief Encounter, and had been the cinematographer on In Which We Serve, in true Renaissance man fashion. I did not know all these facts about him at the time, however, but merely perceived him as a very kind, avuncular chap who was easy to talk to. I'd completely forgotten about the Odessa file, and was running over some lines in the corner of the Coronation Street rehearsal room when the floor manager told me I had a phone call. I leisurely walked over to the phone at the other side of the vast room, away from Roland and the cast who were running a scene, and picked up the receiver. The voice of my agent, Roger Carey, greeted me. "Are you sitting down?" "No." "Well, sit down." I pulled up a chair and sat down. "You've got the Odessa file." "What? You've got the Odessa file? Mary, this is very, very important. You are not to tell a soul about it. Do you understand?" I did not understand, but said yes. Roger continued. "Good. They don't want this to get out till the publicity launch. We'll talk details later. Oh, and congratulations." He put the phone down, and I did the same. The enormity of what I'd just heard began to sink in. I'd just landed the female lead in a huge international movie starring opposite John Voight, but I could not tell anyone. Joy and frustration mingled in my heart simultaneously. I stared down at the twinkling evening lights of Manchester, and knew with certainty that this was a moment I would never, ever forget. I was the daughter of impoverished refugees from a grimy northern town, and now my life was about to undergo an enormous sea change. What else was there to do but pick up my script and go back to rehearsal? Chapter 10, 1974. The Odessa File. Being a film star is only a train ride from Coronation Street. A newspaper headline from the Daily Mail. In truth, of course, there was a lot more to it than that, but it was a slick piece of journalism. By now I'd had the embargo on my silence lifted, and been quizzed by many a hack on how it felt to be a rising film starlet and under a 3-picture contract to John Wolfe of Romulus Films, who produced the Odessa File. I flew out to the Bavaria Film Studios in Munich in the autumn of 1973 for pre-filming preparations, which involved makeup checks, costume fittings and dialogue coaching. The latter required going over the lines in painstaking phonetic detail, a process which was hitherto quite alien to me as an actor, but of course absolutely necessary for the part, as all of the characters in the film were German. Viewing the question of accents in general, and German accents in particular, it seems to me that on the whole, the genuine German speakers who have English dialogue to deliver can vary in effectiveness according to how and where they learned it. There's a very fine line between what sounds authentic and good and what sounds merely cod and therefore dire. This holds true even more for native English speakers, as the gutturally harsh sounds of the German language are really quite difficult to reproduce, and moreover, it's so easy to fall into the trap of the over-the-top style of accents that's so beloved of certain comics, and getting a laugh in the deadly serious film like the Odessa File was certainly not the objective in mind. The coaching was therefore an essential basis for the rudimentary preparation for the movie, and in fact was also very helpful in getting my character, Ziggy. Actors all vary in how they find their characters. Some work from the inside out and some from the outside in. I had not yet found a formula for discovering the truth of the role, but had approached, and indeed still approached, the task instinctively, so really grasping the voice first is as good a way as any to start. I saw the film again many years later. It's churned out regularly every Christmas, and wondered if the critics were right when they questioned the mixed casting of genuine Germans with native English and Americans, all struggling to reproduce dialogue in voices that were not naturally their own. However, all in all, I still think the film works very well, not only on this level, but from the aspect of being an engrossing story with some wonderful performances. It has, for me, stood the test of time. But I digress. Back to the past, and still further back, for the story was set in 1963, in the year of J.F. Kennedy's assassination, and follows the struggle of a young journalist trying to infiltrate a deadly organisation known as Odessa, an organisation of former SS members, whilst on the trail of a mystery surrounding the death of his father. The setting in time was especially poignant for me as, like many people, I vividly remembered hearing of Kennedy's murder, and the impact it had on my outlook on world politics was profoundly depressing. Jon Voight, who played the young man, had been nominated for an Oscar in 1970 for his role in Midnight Cowboy, a film which had totally blown me away. I was understandably nervous about working with him, approaching, as he did in my eyes, the status of a demigod. I was to play his girlfriend, Ziggy, a school teacher earning extra money on the side as a go-go dancer. I'd seen in the new year of 1974 alone in my tiny little bedsit in Fulham. My agent had popped round earlier for a glass of champagne and to wish me luck on the film. On the 1st of January 1974, I flew to Munich on a near-empty flight on which, perhaps auspiciously, the crew were in a celebratory mood, handing out champagne to the meagre handful of passengers. A party atmosphere ensued, and we were soon all chatting away, crew and travellers alike, even popping into the cabin to see the captain, who gave us a quick working resume of the various instruments and levers. Quite unthinkable nowadays. I arrived at the mind-blowingly opulent Hotel 4 Jahreszeiten, 4 Seasons, in Munich, and was led with some ceremony to the suite by the manager, who flung open the huge double doors to reveal luxurious rooms decked with vases of beautiful flowers and bowls of fresh fruit. I was overwhelmed and stammered thanks in my schoolgirl German. Good practice for the film. In fact, I stuck to a cunning plan of speaking only German to the Germans during my sojourn, and found it to be a huge help in maintaining the fiendishly difficult screen voice referred to earlier. Wow! Were these temporary living quarters something else? I couldn't help but compare and contrast them with my cramped bedsit, which was about 12 feet by 8 foot, where mice ran up the curtains and the leaking ceiling splattered drops on my pillow every night. I fell upon the fruit bowl eagerly and demolished a juicy pear in no time. Then I unpacked, hanging my scruffy clothes on the wooden hangers bearing the hotel's name, and stood back to survey the sorry collection dangling in a wardrobe that was almost the size of my room back in London. Ah, well, luckily I'd brought along the black velvet trouser suit. Now, there was one item at least that looked at home. I wandered into the bathroom next, another cavernous chamber, and surveyed the fixtures and fittings with some satisfaction. Oh, this was a lifestyle I could very easily become accustomed to. I drew a bath and had a long, luxurious soak in the fragrant, rich foam until my skin began to pucker somewhat. Well, I had a shared bathroom in Fulham, and there's always someone or other knocking at the door telling me to hurry up, so I was going to make the most of this splendid new bath time experience. Also, in contrast to my meagre dwelling in Blighty, the rooms were hot, so again, enjoying this new comfort immensely, I eschewed my erstwhile habit of bundling myself into something warm and enveloping, and wandered stark naked back into the sitting-cum-bedroom. Suddenly I heard a noise, rather like a doorknob turning, and whipped round. It was a doorknob turning. My doorknob! Someone was coming in, and without knocking, too. I darted back into the bathroom at the speed of light, grabbed a towel which I only just had time to shield myself with before the door opened, and in came Jon Voight. We stared at each other, each as deeply embarrassed as the other, and started stammering at the same time. I was scarlet by now, from the double effects of hot water and discomfiture, so stopped to draw breath, and heard John saying, Gee, I'm sorry, but in my room the doors open onto an inner set of doors, so I guessed yours did the same. We both noticed at the same time that my towel was slipping slowly but surely towards my feet. I twitched it up again, my blushes deepening. Thank God the lighting was low in here. Oh, I see. I laughed, falsely. I felt like a complete idiot, and could see that John could see that I was feeling like a complete idiot, while feeling like a complete idiot himself. What a fiasco of a first meeting with my co-star and erstwhile Oscar nominee. He stepped forward, making a concerted effort to take charge of the situation, and held out a hand from his imposing 6'4" height, dwarfing me almost completely. Hi there, I'm Jon Voight. We shook hands with some difficulty as I was still trying to control the enormous towel that was hitched up almost to my neck by now. Mary Tamm. I nearly, by some atavistically Freudian slip, said jam. Horror of horrors. Great, John grinned. Want to catch a bite later? I rightly guessed that this meant would I join him for dinner, and croaked an agreement. We engaged in some meaningless chit-chat which I fail to remember now, so overcome with near hysteria was I by this time, and agreed on a time to meet downstairs. He left, and I collapsed on the bed in a fit of giggles. What a relief! I sat up and soberly reflected on what a narrow escape I'd had from utter mortification. If that door handle had been turned a couple of minutes, no, less, a minute earlier, I would not have made it to the bathroom to get the towel. I turned red again at the thought, and it took me at least an hour to compose myself and prepare to go downstairs to have dinner in one of Europe's best restaurants with Jon Voight. The Odessa File, based on the novel by Frederick Forsyth, is the story of a newsman whose search for a Nazi murderer leads him to the discovery of a top-secret Nazi organisation named Odessa. The filming took over 3 months in various locations, but mainly in Hamburg and Munich. Our director of photography was the brilliant Oswald, or Ozzy, Morris, who'd won an Oscar in 1972 for Fiddler on the Roof. He was meticulous in every detail, and often the setting up of a scene involved up to 2 hours spent in lighting, while my stand-in posed patiently in my stead. Although this was the norm for major features in those days, it meant a great deal of hanging around in the dressing room, something which I gradually came to realise was one of the hardest aspects of an actor's life, and something I've never really got used to. Mind you, nowadays there's very rarely this luxury of time built into the filming process, a factor I'm actually glad of, being not very good at doing nothing. Memories of this time are dominated by the social life of the film crew, who I mingled with readily, as they were mostly my age. I had a good many days off, and spent my days wandering round the cities we filmed in, both very beautiful in their different ways, and offering much to see. I then swam and did my gym workouts until it was time to go out in the evenings, when we would all meet up and visit the restaurants and clubs that Germany offered, and very good they were too. It astounds me, looking back, how hard the crew members partied, as they had to be on the set every day, which I did not need to be. Ah, the stamina of youth. One particular evening, a pretty female member of the film crew invited me to the birthday party of a friend of hers. As she gave me the address, she coyly confided to me that it would be all girls. What fun, I thought, a girly night out. I arrived that night at the address she'd given me, and entered a dark, smoky flat which was throbbing with loud music. I noticed quite a few men dotted about the place, which was heaving with couples dancing and snogging, and thought, typical, the blokes have gate-crashed. Then, gradually, my myopic eyes became accustomed to the dim light, and suddenly I realised that the pretty crew member had not been wrong. It was all girls, except quite a lot of them were dressed in men's clothes. And I realised I'd been asked along to a same-sex party that would probably involve more than just a bit of sex. Now, don't get me wrong, this matters not a jot to me now in these enlightened, politically correct times of equality for all, but back then I was way out of my comfort zone, especially as quite a few couples were writhing around in ecstasy on the sofas and floor. It was just so in my face, and I had, unbelievably, never before encountered the gay scene in its female form, especially so blatantly displayed. I was out of there faster than you could say grease lightning, and returned to the hotel in the comfort of the film crowd, who laughed uproariously when I told them what had happened, and proceeded to rag me mercilessly about it for weeks to come. Did I feel like a fool? It was not all sweetness and light, however. As well as the long, gruelling hours on set, the costume and makeup fittings and the press interviews, we were suddenly beset by a very unwelcome threat. A police cordon was unexpectedly set up around us as we were filming in Hamburg one day, and we were told that the filming could not continue, as the intelligence services had uncovered a plot to bomb the set. Evidently quite a few neo-Nazis did not like the subject matter of the movie, and had decided to stop it in no uncertain way. Previously, quite a few hotels had refused to put us up, and many locations were mysteriously barred. This all fell into place now, as we realised that they were either Nazi sympathisers or afraid of reprisals from far-right factions. I was staggered to discover that feelings were running so high about the subject matter of the film, not realising how powerful the undercover pro-Nazi feelings were in Germany at that time. But it was quite scary, I can tell you. On a previous visit to Israel, one of the sites which had left an indelible impression was the Museum of Remembrance in Jerusalem, a fascinating city where an eternal flame burns for the victims of the Holocaust. This is featured at the end of the Odessa file in a very moving and memorable scene. I had every sympathy for the sufferers at the hands of the Nazis, especially as so many of my own family had met a similar fate in the gulags of Siberia, and was therefore doubly shocked at the actions of those who somehow condoned the evils of those heinous regimes by trying to stop the film from being made. I think I grew up a little then, as I came to realise that the past is not dead and gone, but ever in our present lives too, as far as extreme beliefs are concerned. One of my most humbling and uplifting experiences at this time was meeting Simon Wiesenthal, played in the Odessa file by Shmuel Rodensky, who was an advisor on the film. He visited the set often. His stories of his work as a Nazi hunter were quite extraordinary, and movingly so. It was he who was instrumental in tracking down the notorious war criminal Adolf Eichmann, and the information he passed on to the Israeli Secret Service and the FBI had resulted in Eichmann's conviction and subsequent execution in 1961. The Odessa file was released on the 17th of October 1974. We had an absolutely fabulous, darling premiere at the Odeon in Leicester Square, and a party afterwards at the exclusive dining club Les Ambassadeurs, or Les A, as it was casually referred to back then by the glitterati. Our leader, Prime Minister Harold Wilson, attended, as did Roger Moore, Joan Collins and Dame Anne and Eagle, to name but a few. My parents, family and friends had attended the viewing, but had not been invited to the dinner, so I arranged to meet them afterwards at Macready's, an actors' club in nearby Covent Garden. I flung a cloak over my borrowed glad rags and cabbed round there with my escort. We had a brief champagne celebration, as it was already quite late, and prepared to leave in the early hours. As I stepped outside through the narrow door, a tall figure loomed up before me, flinging an arm across the exit and barring my escape. Dazedly and somewhat unfocusedly, I had had a lot of bubbly that evening after all. I gazed up from what I thought was quite a height, what with my stilettos and all, to an even greater height at the shadowy figure before me. It was a woman, and she was talking loudly and fluently. At me. After a few moments, I realised it was Vanessa Redgrave, spouting a political diatribe. I knew she was prone to doorstepping thesps as they came out of various London watering holes, but had never encountered her before. I gazed up, awestruck at her presence, tonight of all nights, and took in her mesmerising blue eyes, her perfect willowy frame, her melodious voice, all the time thinking of how I'd seen her play a spellbinding Nina in The Seagull at the Queen's Theatre some years ago, and wishing I had the nerve to interrupt her flow and tell her how much I admired her. The jostling of people behind propelled me forward, and I muttered an excuse and stumbled off into the night. To this day, I've no idea what she said to me. Chapter 11. Life in the Fast Lane, Part 1. Life in the Fast Lane was one of the Eagles' greatest hits, and seemed to be blaring out of every nightclub and fast car in London in the 70s. It was and still is one of my favourite singles of all time, its lyrics reflecting ironically on the lifestyles of the rich and famous of those days, of which I now seem to be one. Well, famous anyway. The appearance in a major film had forced me out of my anonymous existence and humble bedsit. I now had a mortgage on a first-floor, one-bedroom flat in a terraced house in Clapham, and was therefore a lady of property. Not bad for a mill worker's daughter from Bradford. Doing up my own little place was a new and exciting project, and I threw myself into it with gusto, painting surfaces and furniture, and framing posters which were all the rage then. My walls were adorned with Mucha, Munch and Klimt, albeit repros. I became the proud hostess of many a dinner party, always cooking the same meal, chilli and baked potatoes, with wine brought along by the guests. No one was too worried about the unvarying nature of the menu. Cooking was not considered the art form it's become now, with 3 creative and beautifully presented courses being de rigueur. Oh no, the most important feature of any evening then was merely good conversation and interesting guests, neither of which there was ever any shortage of. After being screened in the UK, the Odessa file was released worldwide, and I was asked to fly to South Africa and promote the film there. I'd always loved to travel, but my trips had hitherto been confined to Europe. Now I was thrilled to be visiting another continent for the first time, and as the plane took off in pitch darkness, having been waved off by my mum, I couldn't help but remember the faraway places I used to dream of visiting as a child in cliff villas. South Africa was a stunningly beautiful place, and I was there for several weeks attending premieres in Cape Town, Johannesburg and Durban. More travel beckoned with a film in Greece entitled The Doubt. I stayed in Athens with my co-star, Jenny Runnicker, who'd recently appeared in that wonderful Antonioni movie, The Passenger, with Jack Nicholson. We had a hedonistic time, as there were problems with the financing, and many days were spent lying on beaches or by swimming pools, while the producers had to halt filming due to lack of funds. Alas, it all ended in disaster. My agent called from London and ordered me back home, as my weekly fees had not been paid. I flew back reflecting on the vagaries of the film business, tanned, but broke. In London, my days were spent lunching at the exclusive dining club Morton's, to which I'd been given a free membership by the owner, Peter Morton, who also owned the Hard Rock Cafe, and my nights at Tramp and Annabelle's, the uber-trendy night spots. My life was a whirlwind of parties, premieres and photo shoots. I was always appearing in some magazine or other. Cosmopolitan did an article on my hosting a dinner party. I had a colour spread in the Sunday Times magazine, and the Telegraph ran a fashion article, with me posing in the usual borrowed designer creations. I had, of course, had a little taste of the high life after Witness Madness, but this was more like a 3-course meal in comparison. More opportunities presented themselves as doors opened into new worlds. I was invited to be a judge on the Miss England panel, and opened supermarkets and sports centres. I gave out prizes at Hickstead and Brands Hatch, where I also returned for a day to take a Formula 4 round the racetrack, one of the headiest experiences of my life. One morning I was called to the BBC to meet the director, Moira Armstrong, who'd had such a huge success with that famous series Shoulder to Shoulder, which was about the suffragette movement. Moira was casting The Girls of Slender Means, a new series based on the novel by Muriel Spark, one of my favourite authors. I knew the book, so was well away as we chatted about the character she was interested in me for, Selina Redwood. The story is about a group of girls in a ladies' hostel, the May of Tech Club, just emerging from the shadow of World War II. Its lady inhabitants do their best to act as if the world were back to normal, practising elocution and jostling over suitors and one single Schiaparelli gown. The novel's ending reveals that the girls' literary and amorous pretensions are hiding some painful war wounds. Selina's story was particularly tragic, and I was keenly interested in playing her. I guess my enthusiasm paid off, as Moira asked me then and there to join the cast. Rehearsals began at the BBC rehearsal rooms. It was quite cosy to be back on familiar ground, and went some way to soothing the first-day nerves which beset all actors. We're generally thought of as a gregarious group, but in reality we are, for the most part, painfully shy creatures, especially the female of the species, and as the cast was mainly all women, we crept into the huge rehearsal space in dribs and drabs, and hung around the edges hardly daring to breathe, hoping someone would come up and introduce us to each other, rather like shy teenagers at a first dance. Then something extraordinary happened. A whirlwind appeared at the door, talking 10 to the dozen and carrying along with her piles of scripts, bags and paraphernalia, chattering as she went round the room to the waiting girls, who eventually formed a group around her and began talking to each other in the process. It all happened so quickly that by the time the director arrived, we all felt as though we'd known each other for years. Moira quickly settled us down, gathered us round a huge table and started the read-through. Usually another gruelling process, but which, thanks to the whirlwind, turned out to be a hilarious and easy transition into forming a hugely cohesive group. Whether it was Moira's clever casting or the efforts of the whirlwind, whose name it turned out was Miriam Margolyes, I know not, but the time I spent on The Girls of Slender Means will never be forgotten, as it was undoubtedly one of the most exhilarating and creative work experiences of my life. We all got on like a house on fire from the word go. I would never have believed that a predominantly female group could work so well together, but have subsequently always found the experience, though rare, to prove richly rewarding. The original experience worked largely due to Moira Armstrong's sensitive and intelligent direction. Years later, when I myself was directing Lorca's The House of Bernarda Alba with an all-female cast for a drama school, I drew on Moira's approach as my blueprint. One of the scary hurdles to overcome in The Girls of Slender Means was the ogre of nudity, which reared its ugly head on day one. We had a discussion about how we should approach it, as there was a scene in which it was required from nearly all of us. The story climaxed with a fire at the May of Tech Club, and the only escape route was a window which was so narrow that the girls of the title had to remove their clothing to pass through it. My character Selina kept her underwear on, as she was meant to be the slimmest, but I did have another scene where I would appear naked. I was dreading it, as I'd already done a nude scene in my first film Witness Madness, and had found it excruciatingly embarrassing. I'd had a minor altercation with the director, Freddie Francis, over it. I was being filmed from the back in a shower scene, before being stabbed, and was fine with that, until a break in the filming when a stills photographer had suddenly appeared out of nowhere and started snapping away. I squealed a protest and grabbed for a towel, but Freddie sternly told me to take it off. I protested again, and he then gently told me that it was in my contract to allow stills of the nude scene, a fact which had eluded me at the time. I consequently had to allow the photographer to do his work, but felt somewhat sullied in the process. I learnt the valuable lesson of actually reading a contract before signing it. Since then, I've always been very careful to read the fine print, especially as the script for one of my subsequent films, Rampage, suggested a topless scene, and I was able to refuse when the day came, thanks to the wording in my contract, which generally appears as nudity as agreed by the actor and director. The most important 8 words in a contract, in my view. Our trepidation stemmed mainly from the fact that we had an all-male crew. Unlike now, it was quite rare in those days to have any female camera operators, lighting directors, first assistants, etc., so we decided unanimously that we would all support one another and encourage those who were shyer than the rest. Such heartwarming and highly commendable team spirit. Hurrah! And jolly hockey sticks! As it happened, a quite remarkable thing happened on the day of the mass nudity scene. The crew, who of course knew us all very well by now and, sensing our nervousness, told us they had a surprise for us. We came onto the set in our dressing gowns, and our jaws dropped in amazement. Every single crew member had stripped to his underpants and stood there grinning. We all fell about laughing, almost out of control at this unexpected and hilarious sight, until Moira told us to pull ourselves together. The gowns came off, and the filming passed without a hitch. Many stills photos were taken that day. The girls obviously had not read their contracts, but some of them were taken in a comic spirit. Many years later, the photo session was reproduced with some of the original cast at a reunion for Miriam's 60th birthday at the Ivy in 2001. Fully clothed this time, I may add. Chapter 12. Life in the Fast Lane, Part 2. After my return from Greece, I'd been approached by a high-flying personal manager, James Kelly, who insisted that my career was not really taking off in the way that it should do in the wake of a major movie, and offered to turn things around by taking me on. I was flattered, and agreeing with his view, joined him. He immediately put me up for a project which excited me a great deal, the film version of The Likely Lads, the highly successful TV sitcom. I arrived for a meeting with the director, Michael Tuckner, who was a delightful man. We got on like a house on fire, and discussed the role he was seeing me for, which was that of James Bolam's character's girlfriend. When Michael heard of my background, he was inspired to make the character Finnish, as the language, and therefore the accent, is very similar to Estonian, and the character requirements were somewhat exotic. I couldn't believe it. Yet another film job where my foreign parentage had got me the part. I began filming in Newcastle shortly after. I'd never been there before and loved it, being so close in character to Yorkshire, which I'd not had the chance to get back to very often. The writers on the film and creators of the TV series, Dick Clementini and Lufrene, had produced prolific work for movies and TV over the past decade. I was quite in awe of them both, and of their immense talent. They produced a wonderfully funny script, and my part was very well written. I had one particular scene where I had to throw a prop at a door in a fit of pique. Mike asked me if I'd like to improvise some dialogue, just a word or two, at this point. I was inspired to shout an Estonian swear word, and as the cameras rolled I yelled, "Kurat!" I decided to use a mild expletive for the sake of any Estonian youngsters in the prospective audience. The curse is literally translated as devil, so is not too blue, but it does carry the weight of an equivalent four-letter word in English. The particular moment always brings a smile to my face when I see the film now, reincarnated in its frequent TV repeats. But I often wonder how my oath is translated overseas, when dubbed into another language. After completion post-production, I travelled up to Newcastle by train for the premiere. I shared a carriage with my manager, James, and Bridget Forsyth, with whom I spent a great deal of time on the shoot, and who was, of course, immortalised as Bob's wife, Thelma. She was a very funny lady, quite unlike her screen character, and had us in stitches on the journey north. Next day, the premiere loomed. I knocked on James's hotel room door that evening, as he was to be my escort on the red carpet, but received no reply. I knew he'd been very tired after the journey the previous night, and had slept in that morning. My day had been taken up with the usual press junkets, and I'd not had a chance to catch up with him. I knocked again. Still silence. Tentatively, I tried the door handle, mindful of earlier hotel room encounters in Germany. It turned, and I craned my neck into the room, which was in darkness. Where was James? As my eyes accustomed themselves to the gloom, I could make out a shape huddled under the bedclothes. Lordy, he was still asleep. I shook him awake and told him he had 20 minutes to get dressed and ready. I would wait for him downstairs in the bar. Well, you've never seen anybody move so fast. He was like a tornado and downstairs in 15. As we sat in the back of the limo on our way to the premiere, the story came out. He'd taken a caffeine tablet when he'd woken up at about 11 a.m, or rather what he thought was a caffeine tablet. Turned out he'd taken a sleeping tablet by mistake and had slept the day away. He was, in fact, still rather woozy when we emerged from the limo, despite the alacrity he'd displayed earlier, and as we posed on the red carpet, I was literally propping him up as he blinked sleepily at the flashing paparazzi. All the subsequent pictures of him show him with his eyes closed. The poor bugger was awake all night. James Kelly and I had a close friendship and socialised together a lot back in London. Being gay, he was the perfect walker for me and took me out to all manner of events. He was the son of a very rich business family and flew to Geneva every other weekend to attend meetings. I slowly realised that the personal manager side of his life was really only a hobby for him. He didn't need to earn any money, he had plenty. Apart from the likely lads, nothing much else of substance had materialised for me work-wise. I had to reluctantly admit to myself that joining him had been an error, and though we'd had great fun, it was time to go our separate ways. He took it in good part, knowing, as I did, the truth of the situation, but we remained good pals for a long time. Luckily, I had no difficulty in finding a new agent, and opted for Irene Dawkins, a genteel, older lady. She'd once been a booker at the BBC, and had been married to the television producer and director Harold Clayton, so she was well versed in the workings of the industry. At the beginning of that year, I'd met Val Lowndes, the son of Victor Lowndes, who owned the Playboy Club on Park Lane, where we often went for a quick drink or bite. I always marvelled at the amazing shapes of the bunny girls in their low-cut, high-legged get-ups, giving them nigh on impossibly exaggerated silhouettes, even though I had read somewhere that they had to be trussed, corseted and sewn into their costumes. Although the girls looked very sexy in their high heels et al., there was nothing sleazy about the place. In fact, I was rather surprised at how well the clientele behaved. The rules were strict, with a stringently enforced policy of look but don't touch. It was obviously working well. Afterwards, we would sometimes pop round to see Val's friend, Dodi Fayed, a very polite, charming and handsome guy who had a flat round the corner. I enjoyed his company, as he was very respectful towards women and obviously well educated. It was devastating to hear of his tragic death in that fateful car crash in Paris years later, when Princess Diana perished at his side. Dodi's uncle, Adnan Khashoggi, billionaire businessman and arms dealer, was another colourful figure of that era. I once attended a private dinner party at Animals, where I was seated with Adnan on one side and Caroline Kennedy, daughter of JFK, on the other. Talk about chalk and cheese. It was an interesting evening, to say the least. Val was good fun to be with and had a sense of humour I could relate to. Cruelly, though, he had a bad time with the press, who thought him an easy target because of his family ties. They claimed that he was a playboy in more ways than one, with endless puns on this theme making headlines in the tabloids. I felt sorry for him, as I knew it wasn't true. Not only did he actually work for the Playboy empire, but he was in fact quite a shy man, having been scarred for life by his father presenting him with a bunny girl on his 14th birthday and insisting he took her to bed. Consequently, though close, we had a strangely innocent relationship over the next dozen months or so, with only an occasional bonk here and there. We spent weekends at Victor's country retreat in Hertfordshire, a large and very handsome pile called Stocks. Again, the press made much of the weekend parties here, claiming that wild orgies took place regularly. Well, I have to say, with my hand on my heart, I never saw anything that remotely resembled such a claim. Most Saturday nights, Val and I would retire to bed early, where he'd read to me from the American classics, an area of literature I'd hitherto neglected. Light years away from Fleet Street fantasies. Victor, his dad, turned out to be a lovely man too, and seemingly very ordinary. But as a brilliant businessman, he probably encouraged the press reports, knowing he could only benefit from the salacious nature of the free publicity they engendered for his product, Playboy. Despite these encounters with the press, I made some very good friends among the journalists I met, and even made a foray into the world of journalism myself, via the auspices of a Daily Mail columnist, Sir Patrick Sargent. I was commissioned to write a 2-page spread on women who work from home, quite a bold concept in those days, and enlisted the help of my neighbours in Clapham, who were highly enterprising in their endeavours to make an extra bob or two on the side. I interviewed a knitter, a carpet restorer, and a chef who supplied local eateries from her kitchen. It all came together well, and I enjoyed it, especially when I received my fee, the princely sum of £20. I could now add the extra feather of financial journalist to my cap. Back at Stocks one night, I was asleep with Val beside me when I was awakened by the most awful, blood-curdling shrieking. I opened an eye to see a wild-eyed virago approaching the bed. It was dark, so I couldn't make out who she was, but soon felt the force of her intent when she grabbed a handful of my hair with a vicious yank and dragged me onto the floor. Within seconds, the room was full of people, and she was pulled off me before any serious damage took place. It was Carol White, of Poor Cow fame, Ken Loach's 60s masterpiece of social realism, and a film I really loved, especially as Carol's performance was so powerful. She was one of Victor's weekend guests, and I later learned that she'd mistakenly believed herself to be the only woman in Val's life. I was under no such delusion, but felt very sorry for her, as she was obviously more into him than I was. Poor cow, indeed. After this incident, I grew a little nervous of being in Val's company, wondering how many other jealous girlfriends were lurking in the background. My visits to Stocks tailed off as a result, and Val and I drifted apart. Although we were always glad to see each other when we subsequently did meet up, albeit as friends only. The summer of 1976 was one of the hottest on record, with temperatures soaring into the 90s, we thought in Fahrenheit then. I had a new project on the horizon, and a very exciting one. I was offered the part of Karen in Fassbinder's brilliant play The Bitter Tears of Petra von Kant. The play had a lesbian, or more accurately bisexual theme, and a stellar cast including Angela Pleasance and Delphine Seyrig, the beautiful and famed French actress. I was also reunited with my friend Jenny Runnicker. We'd kept in touch since our bonding in Greece on the Doubt, and were thrilled to be working together again. Jenny was also a very talented painter, and had in fact done a stunning oil portrait of me some months previously, which had even been featured in a press article. I had a massive role, and also a particularly tricky scene with Delphine, culminating in a passionate kiss. We avoided the embrace for quite a time in rehearsal, but eventually the director, Robert Walker, insisted we try it out. Luckily the cast, being female and supportive, did not snigger or make ribald jokes about it, as I'm sure male fests would have done. Sorry, boys, but you know what you're like. So our first tentative brushing of dry, nervous lips was not too bad. We eventually progressed to a long, hearty snog by opening night, but it was always a strange moment for both of us, although not unpleasantly so. The venue was the trendy New End Theatre in Hampstead, and was a converted morgue. During those sweltering summer months, we performed there manfully every night, perspiring along with a restless audience who fanned themselves non-stop. They were riveted, however, and the play opened to rave reviews. The play had become a must-see for the artistic milieu, so that many famous actors, writers and painters came along to see it. It was quite heady being at the centre of such attention. One morning, I received a letter from the local dole office, where I'd been signing on. I did have a mortgage to pay for, after all, and went along to a meeting at the Unemployment Exchange. I was ushered into a cubicle where a stony-faced, middle-aged suit threw down a newspaper onto the desk between us. "Can you explain this?" he barked. I looked at the paper, which showed a large picture of me in the play with a glowing review underneath, and realised with a sinking heart why I'd been called in. The suit obviously believed I was on the fiddle. Wearily, I explained that my fee, which was £20 a week, hardly paid for my petrol. The cost of driving from Clapham Common to Hampstead and back every night was considerable. I could see by the look on his face that he was disbelieving, and he pointedly asked me to produce evidence to back up my claim. The owner of the New End dutifully wrote a letter with the paltry sum I was earning clearly stated in black and white. I heard no more from the DHSS, but hope they learned the valuable lesson that fame and fortune do not necessarily go hand in hand. Earlier that year, I decided to consult a clairvoyant for the first time. The New Age philosophers were starting to take a hold on the enlightened consciousness of the capital, which amused me no end. That is to say, I did not dismiss them, but astrology had been a particular interest of mine since the age of 12, so I somewhat arrogantly considered myself to be way ahead of my time. I had a friend from my RADA days, Nancy Waite, who knew the illustrious astrologer and clairvoyant Frederick Davis, and she tried to get me an appointment with him. It was not to be, as he was booked up for weeks in advance, and being impatient, I arranged for a reading with another friend of Nancy's, a girl called Cordelia Mansell, who had a consulting room in the Regent's Park residential circle. I turned up on the appointed day, and Cordelia spread her tarot cards out on the table. I asked my question, namely, what is the next step in my career likely to be? Cordelia consulted the cards. She was silent, and minutes passed. I shifted in my chair. Cordelia intoned. Interesting. I said nothing and waited for her to continue. She peered at the cards again and then began to talk quickly and fluently. Nothing was mentioned about my career, but she did see a man coming into my life soon who would be tall, dark, and handsome. I nearly laughed out loud at this. Talk about a cliché. I was beginning to regret my visit to this woman already. My mother had been right. She'd warned me time and time again about clairvoyance and fortune-telling of any kind, being the committed Christian that she was. She believed that tarot cards were the devil's Bible, and quoted many passages from the good book concerning false prophets and the like. If only I'd listened to her. My session continued. The personality of the man coming into my life was described in great detail by Cordelia, who even told me his star sign, Aries, a sign I could not get on with at all as far as the opposite sex was concerned, as I was one myself. Believe me, there's only room for one Aries in any relationship. I lost interest in the reading, deciding it was so much drivel, and only half registered being informed that I would not only fall in love with, but marry this person. Furthermore, the union would be more like a lifelong love affair. I managed to hide a snort of derision at this point, paid my money and left. Half an hour later, I'd forgotten all about it. The blistering summer finally ended in September, and in December my sister Tina rang me one morning. We had planned to go up north to visit our parents in Yorkshire that weekend, and were due to travel that very day, a Friday. But now she was ringing to tell me she'd just found out she was pregnant again with her second child. I was thrilled for her, as I already had a gorgeous little niece, and congratulated her on her news, reflecting on how wonderful it would be to have a new niece or nephew. Sadly, she'd miscarried a baby some months before, and had decided reluctantly to cancel our trip for safety reasons. I quite understood and wished her a good rest. I turned to my address book. It was unthinkable to have nothing to do at the weekend. Who could I arrange to meet up with? Just then the phone rang again. It was my pal Sharon Mugan, who'd been playing a guest role in the popular medical series Angels, and the end of filming party was the next night, Saturday, at the BBC. Did I want to tag along? My weekend problem solved. I said yes, and we arrived at the Beeb the following evening dressed up to the nines. The huge room on the 6th floor of the television centre in Wood Lane, where all parties were traditionally held, was already filling up with guests. Soon we were chatting away 19 to the dozen, meeting friends old and new, and generally having a very good time. The party was in full swing by now, and the place was packed, with people jostling and knocking each other. I noticed a tug on my shoulder bag, which was actually more like a large basket, and felt something being pulled out. I whirled round indignantly and came face to face with the sneak thief, who, it transpired, had just taken my hairbrush. He was holding it in his hand. "Is this yours?" he asked. "I found it on the floor." I couldn't believe the transparency of this chat-up line, for that was obviously what it was, and merely glared at the guy delivering it, while registering that, hey, he was a bit of a looker and no mistake. I softened my glare and engaged in some light-hearted flirting. We were joined by his friend, an actor called Sean Matthias, now, of course, a highly successful theatre director, and we all chatted for a while with Sharon and various other actresses vying for attention with the rather gorgeous newcomer. I learned that he was not an actor, but designed sports cars. I did not believe that one, and was right not to, as it transpired later. He was just spinning a yarn to impress me. More importantly, however, he informed me that he was born under the sign of Pisces, one of my favourites as far as the men in my life were concerned. He moved off and soon left the party with his mates. I turned back to the others, strangely disappointed, and was about to carry on carousing when there was a tap on my shoulder. It was Sean. Could his friend have my phone number? I tried to appear aloof as I gave him my number, but was secretly rather pleased. He never phoned, however, and I soon forgot all about him. Christmas came and went, and I saw in the new year with Robin Asquith, actor in the popular Confessions films, and Greg Smith, producer of the aforesaid films, whom I was seeing at the time. We travelled down to the New Forest to meet up with Leslie Thomas, the prolific novelist and author of The Virgin Soldiers, which had been turned into a highly successful film in 1969. Leslie and his wife were delightful, and we saw in 1977 in great style at a riotously drunken shindig in a local inn. I drank a toast to the coming 12 months, wondering what they would bring, little realising that I was about to enter one of the most important and memorable years of my life. End of Part 2. Part 3. Chapter 13. 1977. Marcus. Bells rang out, and gun salutes were fired throughout Britain to herald the beginning of the Silver Jubilee year on the 3rd of February. It was hard to believe our monarch had been on the throne for 25 years. I remembered standing in the crowds that lined the streets of Bradford with my parents when I was about 3, to watch her waving graciously from an opulent limo as she travelled the country shortly after she'd been crowned queen. Now everyone was planning street parties, and our area of Clapham was frenziedly busy with ideas for menus and decorations. The year has started quietly, and I was twiddling my thumbs at home one day when the phone rang. "Hello," came a male voice. "Is that Mary?" I knew the caller immediately, even though it'd been a couple of months or so since we'd met so briefly at the BBC. It was none other than the mystery man who'd disappeared from the Angels party in December, only to send his friend Sean back for my number. "Marcus?" I inquired, for that was his name. To say he was dumbstruck was an understatement. I was actually rather surprised myself, not knowing how, or, perhaps more importantly, why I'd recognised his voice so readily. He remarked upon this fact, and I jokingly replied that he was the first call I'd received since last year. He laughed, a little uncertainly, and came straight to the point. Would I care to have dinner with him tomorrow? I glanced at my diary. I suppose it would have been a good idea to play it cool and pretend I was busy, but I was rather intrigued by this guy, who I remembered only too well as being a bit of a hunk, and acting out of character again, agreed to see him the next night, Saturday the 26th of February. He took my address and told me he'd pick me up about 8. I was applying my makeup the next evening when the doorbell rang. I looked at the clock. 7 p.m? Who could this be? I threw on a tatty old dressing gown and some slippers, and wandered down to the front door, my hair still in rollers. Marcus was standing on the doorstep. "Hi," he announced. "I'm a bit early. Can I come in?" Without waiting for a reply, he bounded up the stairs and showed himself into my sitting room, where he proceeded to turn on the TV. "Just realised there's a film I really want to see." He settled himself onto the sofa as the titles of a Bond movie began. I was torn between exasperation and admiration as I gazed at his perfect profile, and deciding there was no ready or adequate response I could think of, lamely offered him a glass of wine and went off to the bedroom next door to finish my preparations for our night out. It did not materialise as soon as I'd expected, however, and we only left the flat when the closing titles of the Bond film rolled up. It was mildly irritating to come second to a rerun of a picture which I'd already seen, but I thought it best not to engage in a strop on our first date, if that was what this evening was going to be. We had dinner at San Lorenzo at my favourite table, situated under a live tree, and had the usual superb cuisine and service that the restaurant was known for. We lingered over a leisurely meal, and at midnight Marcus raised his glass to me for a toast. I wondered what it would be. "Happy birthday," he cried, and downed his wine. I was nonplussed until he told me it was now his birthday, and he was 26, a year younger than me. I wished him many happy returns, thinking what a strange cove he was. I was starting to like him rather a lot, though, and began to see a lot of him after that, almost every night, in fact. On the 1st of April that year, he took me back to San Lorenzo, and we sat at the same table. I'd learned by now that he was not, in fact, a sports car designer, which did not surprise me in the least, but a law student. I also learned why it had taken him so long to get in touch. He'd been revising for an important exam, and could not leave his studies for anything or anybody. Far from being insulted by his attitude, I was rather impressed by his single-mindedness and dedication, character traits I'd rarely come across before. After the meal was finished, he leaned across the table and said, "Will you marry me?" I replied with absolutely no hesitation whatsoever, "Yes." "Phew," he said, "that's a relief. I thought I'd propose on All Fool's Day in case you turned me down, so I could pretend it was just a joke." Again, as was so often the case with him, I had no reply. Words failed me then, as they do so often now, 32 years later. He was one of a kind. My kind. Even though I had accepted Marcus's proposal of marriage, I still wanted to check him out properly. In my book, that meant another visit to Cordelia to have his birth chart done and compared with mine. When I told my fiancé of my intentions, we were properly engaged by now, and I had a ring on the third finger of my left hand to prove it, he thought I was joking, especially when I told him what it would cost. When he realised I was serious, he told me in a small voice that he had a confession to make. He was not, in fact, 26, but only 24. He'd lied about his age because he thought I'd be put off by his being 3 years younger. I did not care one way or the other, but the adjustment on his birth chart proved to be a revelation. He not only had Mars and Venus in Aries, but also had a powerful Aries ascendant. Cordelia crowed with delight when she showed me the result. He was more of an Aries than I was, according to the rules of astrology. She'd been right after all. Our charts were compatible, and I accepted the inevitable. Far from being put off by his age, I actually thought it was quite cool to be with a younger partner. My mother was 12 years younger than my father, so the age gap was not all that wide. However, I would have been put off by the positions of the planets in his natal chart had I known his true date of birth. It was too late now. He was the man for me, and I was caught. Hook, line, and sinker. Shortly after our engagement, I landed a plum role in a TV series, Return of the Saint, with the dashing Ian Ogilvy reprising the role that Roger Moore had made famous. I was playing a baddie for a change, and relished the part, not least of all because of a catfight with Diane Keane, which was meticulously choreographed. It looked terrific on screen when the episode came out. The car which the Saint drove in the series was a sexy little low-slung sports number, a Jaguar XJS to be precise, and I had a scene in which I had to steal it. I had, of course, been asked at the casting whether I could drive, and had boasted somewhat about my Brands Hatch experience, feeling very confident that I could handle anything after a Formula 4. What I had omitted to mention was that I was as blind as a bat. The day dawned for the theft scene. After my practice run in the Jag, which was a little hairy owing to my blurred vision, I was sent off to wardrobe to change. When I returned, the back of the car now contained the camera operator, sound guy, audio equipment, and a very expensive camera. I gulped. This was another kettle of fish altogether. I didn't want to be responsible for writing off an entire film crew and its equipment. To make matters worse, I was given direction to drive at high speeds, and we were in a highly populated residential area. Anyway, it all went off without a hitch, but it was one of the most tense afternoons of my life. Another scene in the story required my riding in Rotten Row, Hyde Park, where my horse was meant to bolt and would be pulled up by a knight in shining white armour, namely the saint on horseback. Again, I bragged about my riding ability, in reality limited to hacking on riding school nags, and set off at a canter, trying to look out of control on my horse. The trouble was, the horse thought I was out of control. Couldn't it tell I was only acting? And decided to veer off in a different direction. It turned east, and I continued west, cartwheeling through the air in a no doubt picturesque arc, and landing on my back on some very hard concrete. Ouch! Yet another educational parabola, in more ways than one. I could hardly walk at the end of the day, and had to undergo osteopathic manipulation for weeks after. I made a resolution there and then never again to make false claims about my limited skills, but of course I did not keep it. The next part to come into my life was in a movie entitled Rampage, a remake loosely of Elephant Walk, the 1954 movie starring Elizabeth Taylor. I was to reprise the role played by the illustrious star and flew out to Sri Lanka to start a 3-month shoot schedule. I was reluctant to go, mainly because of leaving Marcus behind. He was at a critical point in his law degree and could not afford to come out with me, time-wise or financially, so it was with a heavy heart that I left Heathrow one dull morning to embark on the 13-hour flight to Colombo. I arrived to a humid, hot and heavy climate, and was thankful for the perm I'd undergone on my long tresses, executed by my hairdresser pal Leonard prior to my departure. Without my new style, my hair would have not lasted a frizz-free moment in the damp air. I'd not been to the Far East before, and was immediately struck by the dazzling riot of colour everywhere, in the vegetation, flowers, and painted wayside dwellings we passed en route to my hotel. It was such a contrast to the all-pervading greys of dear old London town. I'd met the director, Manik Chandrasekhar, very briefly in London, and was looking forward to working with him and meeting my co-star, a middle-aged Sri Lankan superstar named Garmini Fonseca. The film industry there was akin to the nearby Indian one, i.e., prolific and musically orientated. This film was different in that it was a straightforward drama. However, as I soon learned when filming began, the rules of movie-making were vastly different to those back home. Garmini was very much in demand. Not only was he mobbed by literally hundreds of people begging for his autograph everywhere he went, but was shooting 2 other films at the same time as ours, and would regularly disappear from our set after a scene and adjourn to a set which had been constructed on location nearby, especially to fit in with his movements, and proceed to sing and dance alongside a cast of thousands. It was so real, to say the least. I couldn't believe the facility of the set builders and producers of the other films he was on, as they followed him around from place to place and simply threw up the scenery around him. He was like a one-man travelling circus. Needless to say, it was also somewhat frustrating at first having to hang around waiting for him to finish his scenes on the other movies, although watching the procedure was hugely entertaining. As with most new experiences in the actor's world, I soon got used to the palaver and learned to be patient, while also picking up quite a few nifty Indian dance moves. There were several setbacks on the film, as Garmini was also a major and controversial political figure and had quite a few enemies. One particular afternoon, whilst filming on a river, the dam upstream was sabotaged, and he was nearly drowned as the waters surged down onto the film crew. Luckily, everyone survived, but a valuable camera was swept away and never recovered. Garmini himself sustained only a few knocks and bruises, seemed to shrug off the incident with insouciance. but it left me feeling somewhat shaken. Prior to my trip, I had naively done no research into the politics of the country, which, unbeknownst to me, was soon to become a much more sinister and dangerous place. Garmany was a wonderful man, and we soon became good friends, discovering that we had a great many interests in common, not least of which was astrology. He was also incredibly superstitious, and had a personal astrologer who travelled everywhere with him. If he was informed by his soothsayer that the stars were not auspicious on a particular day, he would simply inform the director that he was not leaving his hotel, and the filming would be cancelled. I could not imagine such a circumstance occurring in England, but here it was accepted as the norm. I was secretly impressed, and also somewhat gratified, as I was born on the same day as Garmany, although, of course, in a much later year, so guessed that maybe the adverse signs would augur ill for me, too. I had a day off, as usual. It seemed I was more off than on nowadays, what with the increasing bad star days and the political threats, meetings and rallies Garmany was slave to. So I was feeling pretty fed up and very, very bored. I was missing Marcus a great deal, and I'd had little success in ringing him, as the phone system in the country was erratic, to say the least. The only regular contact had been by letter, and I read and reread the few missives I had, trying, without success, to assuage a growing and insistent homesickness. Soon it was time for Marcus to come out for a fortnight's holiday. I was dying to see him and show him the sights. He'd sold his car, an old Merc, his pride and joy, to raise the airfare, bless him. We met at the airport in a damp and prolonged embrace. Was I glad to see him? He'd brought along English magazines, which I fell upon eagerly, and newspapers, which held sobering news. Elvis Presley had died a few days previously, on the 16th of August, aged only 42. I'd not been a fan, but, like everyone else in the world, recognised the passing of a superstar, and felt the same fleeting grief I'd known when I'd heard of Kennedy's death. There were no newspapers in the remote areas where we were filming, so the news was carried to the film crew and other actors, who reacted with sorrow. Sri Lanka had no TV either, unthinkable to a modern mind, but it was such a primitive country back then that Marcus was literally like a visitor from another world. Frustratingly, having had plenty of time on my own, now that Marcus was here, my filming schedule became intense, as I was in scene after scene, day after day. My amour and I began to squabble, and the strain of separation took its toll, with the now mounting pressures of my work adding to our sour tempers. Luckily, our director noticed the not always discreet bickering and offered Marcus a non-speaking role, which kept him busy. All too soon, Marcus's 2 weeks came to an end, and as he waved goodbye at the airport, carrying his bag over the tarmac to the plane, he shouted, "I love you!" at the top of his voice. 100 or so people heading for the same plane turned to see my lonely figure standing on the roof of the airport building and cheered loudly. It was quite a send-off. I headed for a nearby temple, sobbing, and lit a candle for his safe journey. It felt like a part of myself had been wrenched away. If I'd had any doubts previously about my feelings for him, I certainly did not now. I returned to my lonely hotel room, wishing that time could fly. I still had 3 weeks to go in Sri Lanka, and willed it to go quickly. But then, an ugly spectre reared its head. The new government initiated a program against the diaspora Tamil groups living in majority Sinhalese areas, insisting that the state religion will be Buddhist and the language Sinhalese, policies that had been put in place by the previous head of state, Bandaranaike. Violent uprisings and confrontations followed, with the formation of the TULF, the Tamil United Liberation Front, later to become the Tamil Tigers. The skirmishes were bloody, with many losing lives, and eventually led to the Civil War in 1983. By now we'd decamped to Colombo, and as the news of many innocents becoming victims in the fighting grew, The British Embassy recommended that all non-residents return home at once, as the Tamils were specifically targeting whites, threatening to shoot them on sight. As a result, we were living under curfew and not able to leave our hotel rooms after 9 p.m. I was not too alarmed by this state of affairs, but my real fear was the possibility of not getting home. My return date had passed, and all the civilian planes were being used in the military offensive, and even though I visited the Sri Lankan Airlines office each day, I was told there were no flights leaving the city. I began to have vivid nightmares, in which England had been wiped out by a nuclear bomb, and I would never see my home and family again. One morning, I woke up with an angry red rash on my arms and legs. It spread all over my body until only my face remained unblemished. I fled to the airline office and demanded to see the boss. This time, I was prepared. I'd been tipped off to bribe any official I could, and it worked. As I passed over a bundle of notes with one hand, I received an air ticket in the other. I was on my way home. Once on the plane, I still could not relax. There'd been a nasty scuffle at the airport, with dozens of people trying to get on the plane without tickets. Many had been turned away, but some had been allowed to board, being told they'd be thrown off at Karachi, a scheduled stop where others would get on for the journey to London. I prayed I would not be asked to disembark and remain stuck in Pakistan. So chaotic was the system, but thankfully it was okay, although many unfortunate weeping people were taken off the aircraft when we touched down in Karachi. My hideous spots disappeared after a few days back in London, having visited 3 doctors in the hospital for tropical diseases, all of whom told me they were mystified as to what they could be. One morning, Marcus told me that I'd sat bolt upright in bed, screaming in the middle of the night. I looked at my body. My skin was completely clear. I also read that day that there'd been an air crash over Sri Lanka at around the same time I'd yelled in my sleep. The rash had gone, but my awareness of the mysteries of the universe was just beginning. Rampage was, alas, never shown in England, but it became a huge hit in Sri Lanka, starring as it did one of the greatest and best-loved movie stars. Garmini passed away some years ago, but the film is still screened in tribute to him all over the eastern subcontinent. I've never seen it, but Sri Lanka and its esotericism will stay in my thoughts forevermore. Chapter 14. To Have and to Hold. The dull, grey autumn weather of England enclosed us in a giant Tupperware box. Marcus and I, after our long separation, decided to set our wedding date as soon as possible. The following January, the 14th to be precise. It was gratifying to have something to look forward to, and we threw ourselves into a frenzy of planning, flowers, invites, catering, and last but not least, the details of the wedding service. We chose a church in Kensington where Marcus was officially domiciled. Coincidentally, it was also the church where my sister had been married. As my wedding day approached, I realised that I'd forgotten a couple of fairly major items, namely shoes and a dress. I suppose as an actor, the question of what I would be wearing had escaped me, because I'd been so used to being given costumes to wear for my roles. Also, dressing up is so much a part of an actor's life that it's not the big deal it can be for many brides. Their one big opportunity for a fabulous gown may only be on the big day. For an actress, it could be every working day. So, as it suddenly dawned on me that there would be no wardrobe mistress to assist me for this particular part, I went off with my mum to check out a dress shop in Wimbledon. I found a perfect little number within minutes for the princely sum of £5. It had been marked down from 10, so I was very pleased to have got such a bargain, which I considered an auspicious sign. The plainness of the frock was pleasing too. I detested frills, and anyway, it was the ceremony which was important to me, not the spectacle. Mum bought the dress for me, and we carried it away in triumph, purchasing a pair of white sling-back shoes on the way home. Now I was all set and raring to go. I'd kept the details of my nuptials very quiet, as I didn't want it turning into a media circus. Consequently, I invited only one official photographer, my good pal Charles Knight. However, the plan backfired somewhat, as a week later the Sunday Express ran an article entitled, Where was the publicity, bemoaning the fact that my marriage had not been covered by the national press? Heck, I couldn't escape the glare of the media spotlight no matter how hard I tried. We honeymooned in the Canary Islands, where I saw a shooting star, my first ever, in the sky above the hotel where we spent our first night as Mr. and Mrs. I took it to be a happy omen, and I realised, 25 years later to the day when we celebrated our silver wedding anniversary in the Maldives, that I'd been right to think so. Even more spookily, as the thought passed through my mind, my second ever shooting star appeared right then and there and actually crashed into the sea in front of us. Very soon after our return from honeymoon, when we were papped at Heathrow, the press pack descended on me once again. I'd been chosen to play the new companion in Doctor Who. The resulting frenzy at my flat in Clapham, which filled with Fleet Street photographers for an official press launch, more than made up for any grudge the media had against me for missing my wedding. Chapter 15, 1978. Doctor Who. My agent, Irene Dawkins, had a jolly chum by the name of George Spenton Foster, who I'd met on a number of occasions. He was an ageing film and TV director and was, to boot, a very warm, witty and clever man. I adored him. On my return from the Canaries, I had a call from Irene to inform me that George was to direct the 4-part story that would begin the next series of Doctor Who, and was casting the part of the new companion, Romana. Would I be interested? My first thought was to say no. I was not a great sci-fi fan, and had not watched Who for years. More pertinently, I only had a vague idea as to the role of the assistant, which, as I recalled, was a subsidiary one to the Doctor's, and involved a lot of frightened screaming and question-asking. I decided it was not for me, having played much juicier parts hitherto, thereby deeming the part of companion beneath me. I had, of course, seen the inception of the series, with William Hartnell playing the lead role way back in 1963, and remember vividly the excited discussion at school on Monday morning about this new and innovative TV show. It was like nothing anybody had ever seen before. Every Saturday from then on, I would gather with friends at our respective homes, alternating houses from week to week, and settle down at tea time to view the latest episode from whichever sofa we were on. Irene was disappointed at my reaction, which was lukewarm to say the least, and rang off. A couple of days later she called again, to suggest I should reconsider in the light of new information. Not only was the new assistant on a par with the Doctor in terms of intelligence, but she was also a time lady, which was a first, and a completely different kettle of fish from her run-of-the-mill antecedents. Also, it was mooted that she would not be a mere appendage, but a sidekick. This was before the times of strong women's screen roles. The feminist movement was in its infancy, and the major decision-makers in the visual media were almost exclusively male. The late and great Verity Lambert, the first producer of Doctor Who, had of course had a huge input into the show, but she was the exception that proved the rule. I told Irene that this time I would mull it over, and picked up the phone again to speak to my old RADA pal Louise Jameson about it. She was the present assistant, and had, of course, had enormous success with her portrayal of Leela, the savage warrior woman. I had reservations for this reason too. Would anyone be able to follow such a popular act? Louise and I chatted for some time about my dilemma, and although she told me her time on Who had not been all sweetness and light, she exhorted me to go for the part. I called Irene a couple of days later and told her to go ahead and arrange a casting. Unbeknownst to me, and prior to my tootling along to the Beeb for my meeting, Graham Williams, the producer, and George had already seen about 600 girls for the part of Romana, and had whittled the numbers down to just 6 who were now to be screen-tested. I went along, therefore, quite late in the day, and as is always the case with parts that one is not absolutely mad about getting, with a totally laid-back attitude, and also with a touch of "I'm too good for this" thrown in. The arrogance of youth. I positively cringe to think about it now. I swanned in, not aware that the impression I created was exactly what they were looking for in the character, who was a bit up herself, and was told later that Graham and George decided on me in about 2 minutes flat. However, the screen tests had been arranged and were to be the next day. It was, after all, extremely important to see how the chemistry of all the actresses up for the part worked with Tom's. Most unusually, he was to act alongside us for all the tests. Most leading men would not consider lowering themselves to this task. Of course, once I began to play the role, I was actually extremely nervous to be part of this historic show, and any doubts I might have had about my status in regard to it were dissipated. However, I did try and recapture a vestige of the arrogance I'd casually and somewhat ignorantly assumed before, encouraged largely by Graham, who told me it was just what the part called for. George rang me up the night before the screen test. He was really rooting for me to get the part, and told me to try and do something really bold to mark me out from the other girls. His suggestion was that as I was saying a particular line, I should casually saunter over to Tom, wind my arms round his neck and sit on his knee. After we'd said our goodbyes, I put the phone down and considered his idea. I looked at the script I'd been given for the next day and could not see how the lines tallied in any way with the actions George had mooted. Could I make it work? And more importantly, would I have the nerve to carry it off? I decided to sleep on it. I arrived at the BBC the next day and met Tom, who was in a good humour, genial, gallant and jolly. So far, so good. We started the scene, and when we got to the part where George had suggested the cheeky moves, I simply carried on without approaching my leading man in any way, feeling simply too nervy to make any improvised changes. When I told Tom about it weeks later, he roared with laughter and told me I should have gone for it. Poor George was not too amused, however, and asked me afterwards why I'd not opted for his idea. Luckily, I didn't have to answer, as Graham Williams, the producer, came up to thank me for my contribution, telling me in time-honoured tradition that he would let me know. I travelled home in my little Minnie and reflected on the fact that I'd probably blown it, as my director didn't seem too happy with my performance. Ah, well, I thought to myself, I didn't really want the part anyway, but I was lying to myself, as deep down I knew only too well that by now I wanted the part very much indeed. I had a sleepless night, mentally going over and over the scene I'd done with Tom and realising all the mistakes I'd made. I felt surer than ever that the audition had been a write-off. I was wrong, however, as the next day Irene rang me to tell me that I was the unanimous choice for Romana. There must have been 20 journalists and photographers crammed into my tiny sitting-cum-dining room. Graham Williams was there too, desperately trying to control them all, and did an admirable job under the circumstances, as they all milled around, snapping and quacking like so many ducks. I felt a mad impulse to give way to a bout of hysterical laughter, and to deflect this decided to offer the champagne around. I was photographed with a glass in my hand, looking inanely happy, an image which appeared in every national and local newspaper the following day. The Key to Time, as the new series was known, was to be presented under an umbrella theme. That is, each group of 4 or 6 episodes formed one story that could be viewed independently, but all 26 episodes of the overall series opened up into a larger picture, namely, the search for the 6 segments of the Key to Time. Before rehearsals began, I was to be fitted for my first costume, a fabulous floor-length white creation, which June Hudson, the costume designer, showed me the sketches for. I had not 1, but 5 frocks made up in the same design in case of accidents. As it happened, they all later vanished without a trace after filming was over. I know not what became of them to this day, and no, I do not have one lurking at the back of my wardrobe. If only. As well as the dress, I had a gigantic ostrich feather-trimmed cloak to go over the top, in more ways than one. It tickled terribly, and the feathers floated everywhere, much to Tom's annoyance. He could become quite irascible on set, although a sweetie off. Subject, maybe, I surmised, to nerves, just like the rest of us lesser thesps. I was very nervous on my first day in the studio, not least because of Tom's constant snipes about my costume. Too white, apparently, or too feathery, as aforementioned, and I felt quite shaky for the first half hour. I'd not expected this, but the pressure of rising to the occasion was quite terrifying, as is often the case when entering into a long-running series as a newcomer. And this was not just any old series, but a British institution, no less. I soon calmed down, and Tom also relaxed a little, although his language between takes turned the air blue. I blued back, having been warned by Louise not to take any nonsense from him. He seemed surprised at the vocabulary I returned to match his, and gave me a thoughtful stare. Aha, I thought. He's testing my mettle. I hoped I would pass. And so we went on, curse for curse, like players in a tennis game, until we finally established a truce, returning to normal language, much to the relief of the studio crew. Deuce! From there we eventually went on to form a working relationship which we both enjoyed, and which consequently the viewers did too. It was a bit of a shaky start, though. Tom was a very talented actor, and for me, the definitive Doctor. He was in his 5th year of playing the role, and the strain was beginning to get to him. He was voluble in the extreme in his views on the script and the directors he worked with. Luckily, George knew how to handle him, not letting him pause in rehearsal to tell his wealth of anecdotes, and pushing him on in the studio whenever breaks occurred. Some directors, alas, did not have George's skills, and were eaten for breakfast, as Tom certainly didn't suffer fools gladly. I'd never come across another actor like him, but his energy and enthusiasm, coupled with his personality and creativity, could not help but impress. And I became quite inspired in my scenes with him, sometimes as he invented a particular piece of business or ad-libbed a line or two. He certainly kept me on my toes. He was never boring anyway, which I thought to be a good thing, with so long a work schedule stretching ahead. Prior to our studio day, we'd attended rehearsals at the Acton Hilton, which was like a home from home to me now, always a comfort. The guest cast for the Rebos operation, the first story in the series, included Ian Cuthbertson, who'd led those popular TV series of the 70s, Sutherland's Law and Budgie, the latter with Adam Faith. He was a fine performer and suited the part of Garon very well, as it required a combination of skilled acting and humour. Other talents included Nigel Plaskett, Cyril Luckham and Paul Seed, who later went on to become a very successful director. Timothy Bateson, who played Binro, had appeared in the original production of Samuel Beckett's masterpiece, Waiting for Godot, in 1955. I was very lucky overall during my course of filming The Key to Time to work with so many wonderful and illustrious actors. It became one of the perks of the job. After my initial experiences, I always made a great effort to welcome new actors into the series, sensing their trepidation at being in the show, so akin to mine earlier. Rebos, written by Robert Holmes, was an inventive and absorbing story which I enjoyed very much. The script was heavy on dialogue rather than action, and very much driven by the characters, all of whom were well drawn by Robert. It was full of wit, and somewhat theatrical too, which suited George's directing style to a T. There were no location scenes in the story, so all the filming took place in the studios, where amazing sets were dressed and redressed, evoking again a theatrical style which gave the story a historical atmosphere, so essential to the plot. Of course, we also had the inevitable corridors and passages that were the hallmarks of Who. My heavy costume and the heat of the sets made for an uncomfortable working process at times, but the murk of the lighting, or rather the lack of it, helped establish the reality of the scenes for me, especially when I was confronted by the Shrivenzahl, which had 2 men fitted inside a monster costume. To my myopic view, it looked very scary and lifelike in the dark corner it appeared from. Actually, I found all the monsters quite scary, for the simple reason that I could not see any of them very clearly. Taking part in a sci-fi series presented unique challenges, especially when it came to the strange names and technical words that were so often part of the script. My first stumbling block came when I had to pronounce my name, Romana Dvaratralunda, which was a bit of a mouthful to say the least. The original spelling had an N where the TR is, which may well have been a typing mistake in the first draft of the script, so I was even more confused when I saw the second draft and had 2 new consonants to grapple with. Was I glad when I saw it was to be shortened to Romana, or Trattoria Romana, as Lalla Ward wittily quipped when I met her at the read-through for the last story. The character was almost quite as good as promised, although I did still have a scream or 2 written into the role. There was a huge opportunity missed by the writers, and possibly by myself also, to make her more weird. She was from another planet, yet spoke and behaved in a very terrestrial way. Could there have been more strangeness incorporated into the script, a quirky catchphrase or odd physical movement, say? Again, it's probably too easy to be wise with hindsight in this respect. I did enjoy playing her, nevertheless, especially as the series progressed, and was always very happy to be in the TARDIS, my favourite set, though not quite so happy to be enclosed within the confines of the police box prop used in exterior scenes, which was cramped in the extreme, what with a large man and a tin dog squashed in beside me. Chapter 16. The Pirate Planet. After the claustrophobia of the BBC studios while recording the Rebos operation, it was wonderful to have the wide-open spaces of Wales to look forward to. We started the rehearsals for the Pirate Planet, as always, at the Acton Hilton. Graham Williams was absent, having broken his leg whilst on holiday in Madeira, where he was now stuck. So Anthony Reed, our script editor, was acting in loco producer, as it were, as well as doing his own difficult job. K9, voiced by John Leeson, had not featured overmuch in Rebos, but had a lot to do in this story, not least of all a fight with another mechanical creature. John not only read the part at every read-through, but turned up each day at rehearsal to crawl around the floor on his hands and knees in artful doggy fashion. I was amazed to hear later that in fact he was not contracted to do this, but came along out of a desire to assist us with our orientation. And very helpful it was too, in realising the character of this little tin dog, for us, and for John himself. Instead of going into the studio to be met with the anonymous mechanical device operated by remote control and trying to react to it, we had the memory of the character John had created in rehearsal to play to. This enriched the script and the story for actors and viewers alike. The dog had a limited capacity of movement, even though it was the Mark II version of the design, supposedly superior in every way to the first. Alas, it could still only move over completely flat surfaces, and much time was taken up in the studio with laying little paths for him to trundle along, not always obediently, while John did his voice from behind a screen. My part in the Pirate Planet had become more controlling, and Romana took some initiative in operating the TARDIS and being in charge of the jelly babies, which made a change. Tom kept trying to snatch the bag of sweets away from me and reclaiming ownership, but I didn't let him. We'd established a very good working relationship by this time, remarkably quickly, and our humour shone through as we joked on set and off. We had John's witty presence to play off too, in the studio and at rehearsal, and consequently the story worked very successfully on all levels. The script was a very funny one, and heavy on blue screen scenes with a great deal of special effects. These were quite challenging for our director, Pennant Roberts, as in those days we only had analogue technology to work with. Our writer was a virtual unknown, namely the late and great Douglas Adams, who'd left Cambridge 4 years earlier. At the same time as he was commissioned to write The Pirate Planet, Douglas was also given the green light to go ahead with The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy for radio, which has become a cult phenomenon. He wrote frantically day and night. The story relied heavily on Treasure Island in parts, especially in the relationship between the characters of the captain and Mr. Fibuli, played to such fabulous comedy effect by Bruce Purchas and Andrew Robertson, respectively. The captain had a robot parrot on his shoulder, the Polyphase Avatron, which was as highly imaginative as the rest of Douglas's script. He created the role of Queen Xanxia for Rosalind Lloyd, and my old RADA chum, David Warwick, played Keymus. Mulo was played by Primmy Townsend, who turned out to be the partner of my old agent, Roger Carey, so it was lovely to eventually get back in touch with him. It seemed to me that throughout the whole of the Key to Time season, the female guest characters, in keeping with the more powerful status of the assistant's role, were becoming stronger and stronger. Xanxia was just one example, but there were many more, admittedly usually villainesses, but all juicy parts, and enjoyed greatly by the actresses who played them. The programme controllers loved the script, although dubious as to whether there was a touch too much humour in it. They took science fiction very seriously, and quite rightly too. I'm glad they decided to keep it all in, though. It worked well with the way Tom and I were going with our on-screen relationship, and I know from fan feedback that the audiences loved a bit of fun too. There was a line drawn, however. Tom had a scene in which he had to say, "Where's the daring do in that?" He was dying to change it to, "Where's the daring do in that?" which had us all falling about at the read-through, but was sternly given the boot by the 6th floor. Shame. After the read-through, we were ferried down to Gloucestershire in the BBC transport bus, which dropped us off in the middle of the most glorious scenery at a country hotel. It was idyllic, although the weather was somewhat chilly. The cast were all of a similar age group, and it was rather like a loud and noisy party when we all adjourned to the bar later on. We always had a great deal of fun when we were together, although an early night was on the cards this time, to be ready for filming the next day. Our first location was at the Berkeley Nuclear Power Station, which loomed menacingly on the horizon in the middle of nowhere. The interiors, which Pennant had chosen to represent the captain's engine room in the story, were particularly spectacular, with cavernous ceilings and aptly complicated-looking machinery. We were all a little nervous about entering this nuclear facility, as we were old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis and the subsequent screenings of dire warnings about nuclear power and its side effects. We had to be screened very thoroughly before and after entry, and had to scrub ourselves in a shower in case of any atomic particles adhering to our persons. We joked about lighting up in the dark, but no one seemed to suffer any after-effects, thank goodness. Well, not that I know of, anyway. I was relieved to leave this location and look forward to another jolly evening in yet another hotel bar. The unit bus took us to Gwent, where a great time was had by all before setting off to our second location the next day, the Dania Rogoff Caves near Abercrombie, Powys. The caves were dark, cold, damp and smelly. There was nowhere to change, so I had to nip behind a tree with the costume designer's assistant and struggle into the tight white trousers and thigh-high white boots, which looked great on, but took about half an hour to get into. Another stunning costume, but so uncomfortable. We seemed to be down in the caves forever. I did not tell anyone that I suffered from a mild form of claustrophobia when underground. Filming over, I clambered thankfully above ground, stripped off behind the tree, now under pouring rain, and asked the costume assistant where the next day's location was. "A coal mine," she chirruped back. "Oh, no." The next day we set off for the big pit in Blenavon, where we found ourselves in a mine shaft. Luckily, we didn't have to work in an enclosed space, as the large wire cage we were to shoot the scene in was in fact a lift. It had plenty of air and was spacious too, so I breathed a sigh of relief. Too soon, as it turned out, as the darned thing got stuck during rehearsal, and we were left mid-air for about 10 minutes. I hoped it would not come crashing down, and it seemed we were stuck in there for an age, but the technical operator managed to get it going again with a loud shudder, and we descended safely. Was I glad to get out of there? We did have some scenes in the open air, though, notably at Coity Mountain, which made up for the uncomfortable interiors, and the scenery of Wales was spectacular. Back in London, we recorded the studio scenes, which involved plenty of blue screen. It was a new experience to be acting against the blue backdrop, keeping still and pretending it was somewhere else entirely. It all looked okay in the finished product, although I must say the old episodes of Who are so far behind the new series with its immense budget for technical effects. The year The Key to Time was screened coincided with the release of Star Wars, and one could only make unkind comparisons as far as special effects were concerned, with the BBC coming off worst. The particular prop which I had the most difficulty with was the tracer, which always had to be secreted somewhere on my person, and which the wardrobe department therefore always had to accommodate, with secret pockets sewn into my costumes. Not only did I have the fiddle of producing it smoothly and effortlessly from wherever it was artfully hidden, but the wire attached to it had to be disguised somehow, usually by being wound around my bracelet, so I had an extra handicap every time I used it, as well as a heavy battery pack strapped to my waist or back. All in all, I think the Pirate Planet worked well, given the ambitious story and the limited time and money we had in those days. However, although I had fun working on it, it's not my favourite story to view. The storylines are disjointed and never seem to cohere. I still feel confused when I watch it, as I did when I had to do the DVD commentaries, for example, and find the plot difficult to follow. Many fans love this story, however, as they did the whole Key to Time series. Around this time, the publicity machine was once again thrown into a frenzy, as I was asked constantly to appear on TV magazine programmes, giving interviews about my incipient appearance on this highly popular show. Tom was as intriguing as ever, and had a habit of appearing in the mornings dressed in a shirt, Oxford bags, and a jacket on top, with what appeared to be the handle of a toothbrush sticking out of the top pocket. I plucked up courage one day to ask him what it was, and he produced, surprise, surprise, a toothbrush, explaining quite openly that as he was footloose and fancy-free, he always carried one around with him, in case he found himself staying the night somewhere and was therefore ready for any eventuality. His female fan following was huge, and there were always women throwing themselves at him wherever he went. He was also very much in demand for voiceovers, and sometimes, when he had a rare break in rehearsals, he would nip on the tube to Soho, where he would record a commercial soundtrack, usually in about 20 minutes or so, and then nip back, in time to rehearse his next scene. I did admire the man's energy, which was prolific. He told me the story of his life over the coming weeks, and I was impressed to learn that he'd been cloistered in a monastery between the ages of 15 and 21, and then had joined the army to do his national service for 2 years. Having lived in such male-orientated societies for the formative years of his life, it was hardly surprising that he was now making up for lost time as far as the ladies were concerned. One studio day, he came into the actors' canteen at the Wood Lane Studios looking even wilder-eyed than usual, and proceeded to tell John and me a hairy tale. A female fan had been forcibly removed from the security barrier, where she'd been loitering around for hours, waiting for him. She'd claimed to be his girlfriend, which Tom had denied. The story emerged that the previous week, Tom had had a day off, and had set off to a suburban recording studio for a voiceover job. Having arrived with time to spare, he decided to check the address, and rummaging around in his pocket for the details, had found a fan letter from a lady who coincidentally lived nearby. Tom being Tom, he had impulsively bounded up her garden path and knocked on the door. The poor woman nearly died of shock when she opened it and saw her favourite TV hero standing there. Our aforesaid hero had invited himself in and had a cup of tea with her before setting off again for his work appointment. Now the fan had convinced herself that there was more to his visit than was intended. Tom was merely killing time in a highly original and expedient way, whereas she had had the most thrilling and romantic afternoon of her life. John and I were horrified at his tale, but also highly entertained. I could not believe that anyone could be so naive. Tom was so direct and open, which was his great strength as an actor and a human being, but it was also his downfall in this instance, as the demented fan kept turning up day after day to plague him. I think eventually he had a quiet word with her and she finally gave up. But the consequences could have been dire. There were no examples back then of stalking and dangerous threats from fans as there are now, so Tom had a very lucky escape. I could only marvel at the sheer gall of the bloke. What a cove! Chapter 17. The Stones of Blood. Apropos the strong female characters in this new series of Doctor Who, we had a prime example in this story, namely Vivian Fay, played so superbly by Susan Engel, an actress I'd always greatly admired, notably for her prolific and well-respected work on stage. The part was originally offered to Honor Blackman, who declined, as she felt the Professor had all the best material. I set off for rehearsals in a mood of high anticipation, for not only did I have the immense privilege of working with Susan to look forward to, but I was also to meet Beatrix Lehman, playing the part of the aforementioned Professor Amelia Rumford. Beatrix was another highly revered actor, aged 75 at the time, but still with the energy of a 30-year-old. Both ladies turned out to be charm itself, and we soon developed a strong bond, especially as I had scenes with both of them. These were so very pleasant and relaxed to rehearse and record after the male-orientated storylines that had gone before. I always find male actors so competitive. I became particularly close to Susan, even more so when she gave me a lift down to our location filming, when we visited a stately home on the way. The quest for the third segment of The Key to Time took the Doctor and Romana to a stone circle called the Nine Travellers, represented by an authentic stone circle dating back from the early Bronze Age, called the King's Men, part of the Rollite Stones complex near Long Compton in Oxfordshire. The writer for this story, David Fisher, had drawn heavily upon British mythology for the plot, which had supernatural overtones. He was inspired by many legends, such as tales of stones called cycloliths, leaving a circle to travel mysteriously around the countryside, as well as the belief that the number of stones in the circle appears to vary from time to time. The location was suitably mysterious, but absolutely freezing cold. We filmed our scenes at the Rollright Stones with hot water bottles strapped to our middles, as well as several layers of thermal underwear. Poor Beatrix suffered terribly and looked quite blue around the lips as the days wore on. I was glad to complete our filming there, especially as I had a new technique to deal with. We were filming with an OB, outside broadcast unit, which I'd not come across before. This meant that our director, Darryl Blake, was sitting in a large white van, viewing the action on monitors and relaying his instructions via a mic to the floor assistant, or should that be ground assistant, who then passed on his commands and suggestions to us. It was a frustratingly slow and isolating process not to have our director with us, on the set as it were, and I was particularly fond of Darryl. He was my favourite director on the series and became a good friend, together with his wife, the actress Anne Cunningham. The famous cliffhanger scene where I'm literally left dangling on the edge of a cliff was filmed on location on a little ledge and then superimposed via the usual blue screen in the studio. Tom had a shot on location where he's seen pushing me over the edge. He refused to do it, saying quite rightly that any children watching would be horrified at the character's actions, even though it transpires, of course, that it's not really him, so he simply voiced his lines in the studio later. One night, the TARDIS was stolen. It transpired that a group of students had borrowed it for a dare, which gave the props team a few nail-biting hours until it was returned the next day. It seems extraordinary to me now that we only had the one, but again, our budget simply would not stretch to a spare. Because the first episode was underrunning, Tom, John and I had what we thought was a brilliant idea. The Stones of Blood was the 100th Doctor Who story, and we decided to improvise a new scene in which Romana and K9 would celebrate the Doctor's birthday, complete with a cake and a birthday present, a new scarf. We rehearsed the brief scene and showed it to Darryl, who loved it. He became very enthusiastic about the concept of the Doctor's birthday and ordered a specially made cake for the occasion, candles and all. Sadly, it was not to be. David Fisher, Graham Williams and Anthony Reid were concerned about the scene's irrelevance to the storyline, and our very funny, we thought, sketch was axed, to our eternal disappointment. We consoled ourselves with a private party where the aforesaid cake was cut and eaten, while we toasted the 100th story with a bottle of champagne. I only wish we'd written that birthday scene down and kept it for posterity. I'd very much enjoyed The Story of Stones when I first read the script, and was looking forward to the scenes with the Megara, based by David on the mythical Greco-Roman Eumenides, goddesses who persecuted those guilty of a crime. In the studio, we stepped onto the set, very brightly lit and terribly hot, with steeply raked floors which were difficult to move on. We started shooting the scenes which seemed interminable, and were confronted with the difficulty of reacting to the Megara, who of course were invisible at this point. We craned our necks and adjusted our eye lines accordingly, with many a note on where we were going wrong and consequent stops and starts. I appreciated John Leeson even more at this point, realising that his performances in rehearsal made the studio time easier. It had not been possible to have actors floating about in mid-air at the Acton Hilton. How thoughtlessly inconvenient! But in retrospect, it would have given us something to work against had the actors who voiced the judges been present at the read-through at least. When I saw the finished episodes, I was very disappointed. The Megara had been conceived by David Fisher as flying metal orbs, but Darrell had felt that this was too similar to some elements of Star Wars, and consequently altered them to sets of twinkling lights, which looked insubstantial and weedy, especially against the glaring backdrop of the studio. On the whole, though, I always have very warm and happy memories of this tale, especially when I'm having a special treat on a cold day, a little, and to me hitherto unknown, snack from the story: sausage sandwiches. I was about halfway through the series, and I began to realise that it was nigh on impossible to have an equally strong leading character alongside the Doctor's, mainly because of the half-hour format. There's simply no time to have two adventurers going off on different tangents and tying their stories together. Also, and again because of the sci-fi genre, someone has to be a sounding board for the audience in explaining the mysteries of the script, which are often technical, thereby reverting to the usual questions of "Why? What is it, Doctor?" or "Doctor, what does it mean?" I had hoped that there would be a possibility of role reversal here, and that the Doctor might occasionally turn round to Romana and ask the same questions, perfectly feasible and credible in the light of her being a recent graduate of the Time Lord Academy. But alas, it was never to be. It was very much Tom's show, and he guarded his turf fiercely, which was understandable, as he had been in it for years, and had established a popular and iconic character. I was disillusioned, especially as Graham had promised so much, but reflected again on the vagaries of my business, and decided just to get on with it. But I did already know that I would not and could not do another series. The work was hard, and the rewards of the part extremely limited. There was, in my mind, nowhere the character could go. And when I told Graham all this later in the Key to Time schedule during the Armageddon Factor, he took me out to lunch and promised me the earth. More money, more control, more costumes. He even asked if I would stay if Tom left. This was staggering. Was he actually proposing to sack Tom in favour of me? I knew there was not much love lost between them, but had imagined there was at least a mutual respect. I declined, knowing that none of these promises would be fulfilled, but Graham persisted in trying to get me to stay right up to the very last day of shooting, blind to the fact that I was adamant about going. So many fans have asked me why I did not have a regeneration scene at the end of my time as Romana. It would have been an ideal opportunity for innovation. She was the first Time Lady companion, after all, and her reincarnation could have been spectacular. The reason is simple. Graham simply could not believe that I would not return. Although I was so very disappointed not to have that scene in the next series, I'm still very proud that I was the first generation of the Lady Romana Dvaratralunda.